Welcome, weary travelers of the night, to At Hollow Midnight. If you find yourself staring at the ceiling, caught between the twilight of consciousness and the elusive embrace of sleep, perhaps a truly boring bedtime story is precisely what you need. Consider subscribing, for there is an endless supply of peculiar narratives awaiting your curious mind, each designed not to lull you into slumber, but to gently distract you from the insistent clamor of the world, much like a faint, persistent hum from a distant, forgotten clock. Chapter 1. The Sleepless Alchemist's first revelation in the labyrinthine heart of the city of Eldoria, where cobblestones glistened perpetually with the damp residue of 1,000 forgotten rains, and the air hung thick with the mingled scents of damp earth, stale bread, and the inexplicable aroma of singed feathers, lived an alchemist named Kalen. He was not, it must be said, an alchemist of the grand gold-making tradition, nor one particularly interested in the elixir of eternal youth, though he often wondered quite idly what an eternity of conscious thought might truly feel like. Kalen's true obsession, his peculiar magnum opus, revolved around an entirely different, and to most, utterly preposterous substance, sleep, or rather, the absence of it. His small, perpetually grimy workshop, nestled in the eaves of a sagging tenement, was a testament to his singular focus. Vials of murky liquids, their contents perpetually churning, lined precarious shelves that groaned under their collective weight. Distillation apparatus, cobbled together from copper piping and repurposed kitchenware, bubbled with a melancholic hiss, often spitting acrid steam into the already pungent atmosphere. The floor was a chaotic tapestry of arcane diagrams, discarded notes scribbled in a furious hand, and a bewildering array of dried herbs that smelled faintly of forgotten dreams and mildew. One might trip over a tome on forgotten lunar cycles, only to land awkwardly beside a collection of meticulously labeled jars containing various forms of powdered fungus, each intended for some esoteric, anti-somnolent purpose. Kalen himself was a man forged in the crucible of perpetual wakefulness. His eyes, though keen, were rimmed with a perpetual crimson, like the embers of a dying fire. His hair, a disheveled shock of straw-like gray, often stood on end as if perpetually shocked by the sheer audacity of the universe. His clothes, perpetually smelling of ozone and a faint, unsettling sweetness, were patched and repatched, their original colors lost beneath layers of spilled reagents and dust motes. He rarely ate, preferring to subsist on the nervous energy of his own relentless curiosity, supplemented by bitter tinctures brewed from obscure roots found only in the darkest corners of ancient forests. He owned no bed, his sleeping arrangements consisting of an uncomfortable stool where he occasionally slumped, only to snap awake moments later with a profound sense of wasted time. It was during one such accidental, fleeting slump, some 7 years prior, that the first seed of his grand theory had been planted. He had been attempting to synthesize a particularly potent variation of his awake draught, marked 7th, a concoction he hoped would render sleep utterly obsolete for at least a week, when a sudden, inexplicable wave of exhaustion had washed over him. His head had hit the workbench with a dull thud, and for a mere 5 minutes, perhaps 6, he had been lost to the void. Upon awakening, disoriented and sticky with spilled reagents, a curious thought had pricked at his mind like a needle made of frost. Why did it happen? Why, after days of continuous vigilant effort, did his body betray him with such profound, unyielding demand? He had begun then to observe, not just himself, but the denizens of Eldoria. He watched the lamplighters douse their flames at dawn, their faces slack with a profound weariness. He observed the street sweepers, their movements sluggish, their eyes unfocused. He saw the merchants yawn behind their stalls, the guardsmen nod off on their watches, even the esteemed members of the Grand Council of Elders, in their gilded chambers, occasionally succumb to a dignified, if somewhat disturbing, drool. Everyone, without fail, seemed to participate in this great collective surrender. And it was this universality, this undeniable pervasive presence of sleep across all strata of society, that began to gnaw at him. It simply did not make sense, he reasoned, his mind a whirlwind of frantic calculations and half-formed hypotheses. Why would nature, in its infinite wisdom and relentless pursuit of efficiency, design a creature that required a third of its existence to be utterly unproductive, vulnerable, and prone to bizarre, often nonsensical, internal hallucinations? It was an evolutionary oversight of colossal proportions, a glaring flaw in the grand tapestry of being. Unless, of course, it wasn't natural at all. This thought, once it had taken root, blossomed into a thorny, complex vine that entwined itself around every corner of Kalen's intellect. What if sleep, this ubiquitous, unyielding force, was not a biological imperative, but an imposed one? A tool, subtle and insidious, designed not by the indifferent hand of evolution, but by a more deliberate, more Machiavellian intelligence. He began to pore over ancient texts, not for alchemical secrets, but for any mention, however fleeting, of a time before sleep was so widespread. He found nothing definitive, only vague myths of a golden age where beings walked for days without rest, their minds eternally clear. These, he concluded, were not myths at all, but fragmented truths, echoes of a forgotten reality. His first revelation, therefore, solidified into a terrifying, yet exhilarating conviction. Sleep was a government conspiracy, not the visible, bumbling government of Eldoria, with its perpetually squabbling council and its endless stream of petty decrees, but a deeper, more ancient, more powerful entity. An unseen hand pulling the strings of collective consciousness, ensuring that humanity, for a significant portion of its life, remained docile, distracted, and utterly unaware of the true nature of its existence. He imagined in his most feverish moments of wakefulness that the very air was laced with soporific dust, or that the moon itself, in its serene silvery gaze, emitted waves of hypnotic somnolence. Perhaps the very concept of night, with its comforting darkness and quietude, was a grand illusion, a psychological trigger engineered to usher millions into their nightly stupors. The lullabies sung to children, the comforting warmth of a hearth fire, the repetitive drone of a distant bell, all in Kalen's mind, were subtle tools of control, whispers of a vast unseen apparatus designed to enforce universal unconsciousness. The purpose, he concluded, was manifold. Firstly, to prevent independent thought. A sleeping mind, he argued, was a pliable mind. Dreams were not random neurological firings, but carefully orchestrated narratives, implanted suggestions designed to reinforce societal norms, to quell dissent, or to simply waste valuable mental energy on nonsensical escapades. While a body slept, its mind was not resting, but being subtly reprogrammed. It was a mass hypnotic suggestion, delivered nightly to millions, ensuring a compliant, unquestioning populace. Secondly, and perhaps more crucially, it was about stolen time. Think of it, he would mutter to himself, pacing his workshop, leaving trails of soot and spillage in his wake. 8 hours a day, 1/3 of one's life, lost. What could humanity achieve if that time were reclaimed? If every individual had an additional 8 hours of waking, productive, conscious thought, the advancements would be astronomical. The secrets of the universe laid bare, the very fabric of reality unraveled. And that, he believed, was precisely what this unseen government feared. An awakened populace was a dangerous populace. An ever-thinking populace was an uncontrollable populace. He began to sketch elaborate diagrams, not of alchemical transmutations, but of unseen networks, lines connecting slumbering households, radiating outwards from some perceived central hub of control. He hypothesized about invisible towers emitting sleep rays, or clandestine dreamweavers who manipulated the collective unconscious. His theories grew more outlandish, yet to Kalen, they possessed an undeniable, terrifying logic. The evidence, to his perpetually weary mind, was everywhere. The pervasive exhaustion, the general acceptance of this biological necessity, the very ease with which people succumbed. It was too perfect, too efficient, to be merely natural. His initial attempts to counteract this supposed conspiracy were, admittedly, rather modest. He experimented with various unpleasant-tasting elixirs, each designed to keep him awake for just a little longer, to peel back another layer of the vast. Lo somnolent deception. He tried bathing in cold water at midnight, humming dissonant tunes, even occasionally sticking himself with a rusty needle, all in the name of resisting the creeping onset of nightly oblivion. He catalogued his observations of others, the subtle signs of impending surrender to the sleep spell, the glazed eyes, the slumped postures, the gentle, rhythmic breathing that to Kalen sounded like the sigh of a soul being quietly stolen. This peculiar conviction, born of sleepless nights and an overactive, chemically stimulated mind, did not, it must be said, endear him to the few neighbors who were aware of his existence. They saw only an unkempt eccentric, muttering to himself about lunar influences and the tyranny of the pillow. But Kalen paid them no mind. Their ignorance, he reasoned, was merely further proof of the conspiracy's efficacy. They were the willing participants, the unwitting victims of the greatest, most pervasive illusion ever cast upon humanity. And he, Alchemist Kalen, the sleepless sentinel of Eldoria, was determined to expose it, to unmask the shadowy architects of the great slumber, and to, perhaps, one day, awaken the world. His bizarre journey had only just begun. Chapter 2. A brief history of sleep, or lack thereof. Kalen, having solidified his utterly peculiar, yet to him, unassailable conviction regarding the conspiratorial nature of sleep, wasted no time in expanding his field of inquiry. His workshop, once merely a laboratory for the defiance of unconsciousness, transformed into an archival delve, a dusty bastion against the insidious tides of somnolence. His initial approach, one of furious alchemical experimentation, began to yield to the more methodical, if still utterly manic, discipline of historical forensics. He believed, with the unwavering certainty of a man who hadn't truly rested in years, that the tendrils of this grand slumber conspiracy reached far back into the forgotten annals of time. If sleep was an imposition, a meticulously engineered mechanism of control, then surely its origins, its subtle progression, must be etched, however faintly, into the historical record. His hunt began in the Eldoria Grand Library, a sprawling edifice of weathered stone and creaking timber, whose air was perpetually thick with the scent of decaying parchment and the faint, sweet perfume of centuries-old dust. Kalen, a creature of the twilight hours, often found himself borrowing ancient folios and bound scrolls under the cloak of deepest night, his movements as silent and unobtrusive as a particularly well-greased rat. The librarians, a pair of ancient spectacles-wearing siblings named Thorn and Willow, had long ago grown accustomed to Kalen's peculiar habits, including the faint, inexplicable aroma of singed cinnamon, and something akin to damp earth that always seemed to cling to his person. They simply sighed, adjusted their reading glasses, and pretended not to notice the sudden, inexplicable shift in the weight of the forbidden text section. Kalen was not looking for overt confessions of a sleep-controlling cabal. He sought patterns, anomalies, the subtle, telltale signs of manipulation hidden within the mundane. His first forays into the past led him to the sun-baked lands of ancient Kemet, a civilization obsessed with death, dreams, and the afterlife. Kalen found references to elaborate dream interpretation rituals, to priests who would spend nights in sleep temples, seeking prophetic visions or divine guidance. He scoffed, a dry, rasping sound that usually made the dust motes dance in his workshop's solitary shaft of moonlight. Prophetic visions. Pah, head mutter, eyes narrowed, tracing the faded hieroglyphs, more like state-sanctioned indoctrination. They weren't interpreting random dreams. They were receiving instructions, reinforcing control narratives embedded within the dream state. He meticulously copied descriptions of specific herbs and incense used to induce certain dream conditions, seeing them not as spiritual aids, but as early forms of dream programming agents. The naivety of ancient scholars who truly believed these rituals were for spiritual enlightenment struck him as hilariously tragic, a testament to the conspiracy's long-standing efficacy. Spiritual enlightenment, he'd whisper to a bubbling flask, is merely a convenient illusion to disguise the nightly mental subjugation. Further west he delved into the philosophical musings of ancient Hellas. Here, thinkers grappled with the very nature of sleep, often describing it as a lesser death, a temporary separation of the soul from the body, or a period of profound vulnerability. Kalen zeitzed upon these descriptions with the fervor of a starved man discovering a forgotten banquet. "Temporary separation," he'd exclaimed to the peeling plaster of his ceiling. Exactly. A severing from one's true, conscious self, orchestrated to render the vessel inert and pliable. He interpreted the heated philosophical debates on the nature of dreams not as genuine intellectual inquiry, but as veiled attempts by early, perhaps unwitting, resistors to understand the mechanics of the imposed dreamscape, or perhaps clumsy attempts by the manipulators themselves to refine their techniques. He even found fragmented accounts of certain philosophers and ascetics who seemed unusually vibrant, tireless, and perpetually lucid. Kalen immediately labeled these individuals as early non-sleepers or rogue elements, lone beacons of wakefulness in a world succumbing to collective oblivion. Their purported madness or saintliness, he concluded, was merely the conspiracy's method of discrediting those who stumbled upon the truth. The grandeur of the Roman Empire, with its lavish baths and periods of enforced leisure, provided further grist for Kalen's peculiar mill. He viewed the extensive bathing rituals and the emphasis on relaxation not as expressions of societal well-being, but as necessary recovery periods from the nightly data download. The very concept of leisure, he argued, was a cleverly constructed illusion designed to make the debilitating fatigue imposed by the conspiracy seem desirable, a reward for enduring the nightly mental subjugation. Even the famed Roman roads, he mused, were not just for trade and legions, but for the swift transport of slumber-inducing agents, or perhaps for the silent movement of sleep wardens monitoring the populace's unconscious hours. As Kalen traced the historical narrative forward, he noted a curious phenomenon, the increasing prevalence of insomnia as a recognized affliction. He didn't see this as a medical condition, but as the system malfunctioning, or more optimistically, as individuals subtly resisting the nightly programming. He uncovered bizarre, often repugnant, cures for insomnia. Tying garlic around the neck, sleeping with a raw onion under the pillow, a particularly potent and pungent folk remedy. Drinking potions made from poppy seeds, powdered owl feathers, or in one gruesome account, the rendered fat of a freshly deceased badger. These, Kalen argued, were not simply superstitious nonsense. They were desperate, often futile attempts by the common folk to reclaim their nights, to break free from the invisible chains. Or, he theorized, some were counter-conspiracy remedies, devised by forgotten ancient alchemists who, like him, had glimpsed the insidious truth. He meticulously copied down these recipes, not to use himself. He preferred his own rigorously tested, if volatile, concoctions, but to analyze for hidden clues about the sleep-inducing agents they were intended to counteract. He even found snippets referencing individuals who reportedly never slept, dismissed by their contemporaries as madmen, mystics, or unfortunate souls cursed by vengeful deities. Kalen, however, immediately elevated these figures to prophetic status, unwitting heroes of the nascent anti-sleep movement. Their existence a living refutation of the conspiracy's grand lie. It was in the grim, shadowed annals of the medieval period that Kalen's theory truly soared, reaching dizzying new heights of paranoid brilliance. He uncovered gruesome accounts of medieval torture methods, and among them, sleep deprivation stood out like a blood-soaked banner. "Aha!" he'd cackle, a dry, rasping sound that rattled the vials on his shelves, and made the copper stills tremble. Direct evidence. They understood its power, not just to break the body, but the mind itself. He described, with a slightly detached academic fascination, the methods. Victims chained to chairs, their eyelids propped open. Continuous yarring noise, forced standing in cramped cells. Constant prodding from cruel guards, bright, unblinking lamps pointed directly at the eyes. Kalen interpreted these not as mere means to extract confessions, but as elaborate, grotesque experiments. Attempts by the authorities of the time to understand the absolute limit-seeing of human wakefulness, to reverse engineer the sleep mechanism they had themselves imposed upon humanity. They were studying the breaking point, he argued, perfecting their own system of control. The goal wasn't just to make someone talk, but to reduce them to an animalistic state of compliance, proving that an unsleeping mind, if not properly managed by the conspiracy, became chaotic, deranged, and utterly unthinking, thus ironically justifying the need for sleep. They were proving their own propaganda. Kalen would whisper conspiratorially to a bubbling flask of what appeared to be fermented turnip juice. He found accounts of individuals who, after prolonged sleep deprivation, would hallucinate wildly, become profoundly docile, or simply utterly break down, their minds dissolving into a puddle of gibbering incoherence. Kalen viewed these hallucinations not as products of a deranged mind, but as the mind attempting to create its own reality in the absence of the imposed dreamscape. A desperate surge of creative resistance before succumbing. The docility that followed? That was merely the crushing exhaustion that mimics sleep's docile effects, further confirming that controlling sleep was the most effective pathway to controlling the masses. He even stumbled upon texts detailing the infamous witch trials where sleep deprivation was ruthlessly employed. He argued that the confessions extracted were not from actual guilt or demonic pacts, but from minds so thoroughly broken by the absence of the imposed sleep that they would parrot any narrative, no matter how absurd, thus demonstrating the ultimate, terrifying power of sleep as a control mechanism. The very concept of nightmares, he concluded, were nothing more than programmed fear responses, designed to prevent individuals from consciously resisting the nightly program. Kalen often found himself pondering the vast, staggering economic implications of this insidious conspiracy. The sheer, colossal loss of productive hours across the entire globe, day after day, century after century. The necessity for an entire infrastructure to support sleep. Beds, quiet rooms, specialized fabrics, night watchmen, even the very architecture of homes designed to facilitate darkness and repose. He saw this not as a natural societal development, but as a vast, resource-draining enterprise designed to keep the economy just productive enough to survive, but never truly flourish, thus preventing the accumulation of independent wealth and power outside the direct control of the sleep masters. Every pillow sold, every curtain drawn, every lullaby sung, every flickering street lamp dimmed at dawn in Kalen's fevered imagination was a small, unwitting tribute to the conspiracy, a silent act of compliance in the grand deception. His research only deepened his conviction, cementing the bizarre framework of his worldview. If possible, He was even more sleep-deprived, his eyes now resembling perpetually inflamed rubies, his theories growing increasingly elaborate, self-reinforcing, and strangely poetic in their dark absurdity. He saw the historical record not as a chronicle of humanity's past, but as a meticulously curated ledger of the conspiracy's progress, a grand, deceptive narrative. Every piece of historical information, no matter how innocuous, became a crucial clue, a missing piece of a gargantuan, terrifying puzzle. He was convinced he was on the verge of uncovering the true origin point, the precise moment humanity first succumbed to the great slumber. The smell of his workshop grew ever more potent, a heady, dizzying mix of old paper, strange chemicals, and the unshakable scent of relentless, unyielding suspicion. He often forgot to distinguish between the factual historical accounts and his own increasingly vivid, fevered interpretations, weaving them seamlessly into a single, grand, exquisitely paranoid tapestry. He felt, in his waking hours, a growing sense of urgency, a desperate need to uncover the final threads before the pervasive unseen hand of slumber inevitably reached for him. Chapter 3. The Alchemist's Midnight Epiphany. Kalen's deep dive into the historical record had only served to further solidify the bedrock of his outlandish theory. The scent of ancient parchment now mingled inextricably with the fumes of his perpetually bubbling retorts, creating an olfactory signature that was uniquely Kalen, a heady, dizzying cocktail of forgotten knowledge and volatile chemistry. His historical findings, whether it was the curious insomnias of ancient pharaohs or the chilling uses of sleep deprivation in medieval dungeons, had not merely corroborated his belief. They had amplified it, transforming a peculiar notion into an all-consuming, unshakable conviction. He now saw the entire panorama of human history as a meticulously crafted stage upon which the great slumber played out its insidious drama. Every yawn was a silent, involuntary act of surrender, every slumbering city a monument to the conspiracy's crushing efficiency. He rarely left his workshop now, his gaunt frame a mere whisper of a man, fueled by bitter tinctures and an incandescent, unwavering suspicion. The particular night of his true epiphany was, in many ways, indistinguishable from the hundreds that had preceded it. The moon, a pallid disk behind Eldorius' perpetual haze, cast a weak, watery glow through the single, grime-caked window of his workshop. The air was thick with the humid exhalations of simmering liquids, and the dry, papery dust of countless unread books. Kalen sat hunched over a particularly large, unwieldy volume, its vellum pages brittle with age, detailing various ancient Roman somnus rituals ceremonies, designed, ostensibly, to induce prophetic dreams or facilitate communication with the underworld. To Kalen, they were merely early, clumsy attempts at dream programming, primitive forerunners to the vast invisible network he imagined now controlled the world's collective unconscious. He had been awake for what felt like an eternity, his mind a feverish hive of buzzing thoughts, each one a tendril reaching further into the web of his conspiracy. His eyes, now permanently stained crimson, twitched involuntarily, and a persistent, high-pitched ringing had taken up residence in his left ear, a private, constant symphony of wakefulness. Head tried a new variant of his potent anti-somnolent draught, a concoction designated Mark X, the Vigilant's Last Stand, brewed with rare black poppy seeds and the pulverized antennae of an elusive nocturnal moth. It had, as was often the case with his more ambitious formulas, imbued him with an unsettling, almost vibrating energy, a hyper-awareness of every creak of the floorboards, every distant clang from the city below, every almost imperceptible shift in the air pressure within his cramped quarters. He was tracing a diagram, an elaborate, strangely beautiful rendering of what appeared to be a Roman sleep temple, when a subtle shift in the air currents behind him caused him to freeze. It wasn't a draft. His workshop was notorious for its stagnant, unmoving atmosphere. It was a displacement, as if something had just materialized in the space. Kalen, his senses acutely sharpened by days of uninterrupted wakefulness, and the peculiar effects of Mark X, did not immediately turn. He merely tightened his grip on the ancient tome, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He had, for months, anticipated such an encounter. His theories had evolved to include sleep wardens, shadowy operatives who monitored those who resisted the universal slumber, agents of the unseen government sent to correct anomalies. He had imagined them as hulking brutes, or perhaps ethereal spirits, but never quite like this. Slowly, with the deliberate caution of a man defusing an invisible bomb, Kalen twisted his neck, his eyes, burning with feverish intensity, sweeping across the cluttered workshop. There, standing almost perfectly still between a bubbling alembic and a stack of his discarded, singed notes, was a figure. It was not hulking nor ethereal. It was instead disconcertingly ordinary, clad in simple, dark clothing that seemed to absorb the meager light. The figure was neither tall nor short, neither overtly menacing nor overtly benign. Its features were obscured by the deep shadow cast by the angle of Kalen's dim lantern and a hood pulled low. But Kalen could feel an intense, almost palpable presence radiating from it, an unnerving stillness that felt utterly unnatural in a world of constant motion. He saw no breath misting in the cool air, heard no rustle of fabric, no creak of shifting weight. It was as if a piece of the midnight itself had decided to stand upright and observe him. Kalen did not speak. He merely watched, his mind racing, cataloging every minute detail of the unsettling apparition. The air in the workshop, already heavy, seemed to thicken, pressing in on him. The high-pitched ringing in his ear grew louder, then faded, replaced by a profound, echoing silence that felt heavier than any sound. The figure, still unmoving, slowly extended a hand. Kalen braced himself, expecting a blow, a syringe, a subtle, hypnotic gesture. But the hand, gloved in dark leather, merely lowered itself to a precarious pile of his meticulously sorted historical notes. With an unnerving slowness, the figure picked up a single, crumpled sheet of parchment. It was one of Kalen's own notes, a page detailing his hypothesis on the Roman somnus rituals being a form of early dream programming. The figure held the note for a long moment. Then, with a movement almost too fluid to follow, it meticulously, almost deliberately, folded the parchment in half. Then again, and again. Each fold was precise, sharp, final. Kalen watched, mesmerized by the unnerving calm of the action. It was not violent, not overtly threatening, yet it carried an undeniable weight of intention, a chilling sense of purpose. When the parchment was reduced to a tiny, tightly compressed square, the figure, with the same unsettling grace, placed it carefully back onto the stack of notes. Not in its original position, but on top of a stack of Kalen's theories about medieval sleep deprivation as a government research initiative. Then, for the first time, the figure made a sound. It was not a voice, but a soft, almost imperceptible sigh. A breath of air that seemed to carry the weight of forgotten centuries. And then, it turned its head slightly, just enough for Kalen to perceive a glint, a momentary reflection of light in the shadowed abyss of the hood where eyes should have been. It was not a malevolent glint, nor a mocking one. It was, impossibly, a glint of what Kalen could only interpret as understanding, and perhaps a hint of weary patience, as if it had seen countless men like him in countless rooms, across countless ages, and knew precisely what they were thinking. Before Kalen could react, before he could even draw a full breath, the figure dissolved. Not vanished in a puff of smoke, or faded like a ghost, but simply ceased to be. One moment it was there, a solid, unsettling presence, and the next, it was gone, leaving only the oppressive silence and the lingering faint scent of ozone that Kalen had often attributed to his own volatile concoctions. The small, folded parchment lay undisturbed on his notes. Kalen remained frozen for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the spot where the figure had stood. Then, a peculiar, almost maniacal grin slowly spread across his face, cracking the dry skin of his lips. His crimson eyes blazed with a terrifying clarity, all traces of fatigue seemingly banished by the sheer, exhilarating shock of the encounter. He let out a low, raspy chuckle, a sound like dry leaves skittering across cobblestones. "I knew it," he whispered, his voice hoarse with disuse and triumph. "I knew it. The figure, its silent arrival, and even more silent departure, its deliberate folding of his research, the single, understanding glint in the shadows. It wasn't a hallucination." Kalen was absolutely, unequivocally certain. This was not the product of sleep deprivation. This was the proof of the conspiracy. The figure was a sleep warden, an agent dispatched by the unseen government, a silent sentinel sent to monitor his defiant wakefulness. The folded note, placed precisely on his medieval research, was not a random act. It was a message, a subtle acknowledgement that his theories were correct, that he was getting too close, that they knew he was observing them. The understanding in its eyes? That was the chilling realization that they were aware of his every thought, his every sleepless moment. It was a warning, delivered with the quiet, chilling precision of a perfectly aimed dart. This encounter, so subtle yet so profoundly impactful, irrevocably cemented Kalen's conviction. It wasn't just a theory anymore, it was a confirmed reality. He hadn't stumbled upon a grand delusion. He had peeled back the veil of the greatest deception in human history. The midnight epiphany was not a moment of divine inspiration, but a cold, hard confirmation that his paranoia was not, in fact, paranoia at all. Acute, terrifying insight. The very act of the figure touching his research on dream programming and sleep deprivation was, to Kalen, undeniable proof that these were indeed the tools of the conspiracy. They were mocking him, perhaps, or simply acknowledging that he was now officially on their radar. He spent the rest of the night, and indeed the following weeks, in a state of heightened, almost frenzied wakefulness, the effects of Mark X now amplified by the sheer force of his newfound certainty. He no longer simply theorized about sleep wardens. He knew they existed. He no longer merely suspected dream programming. He knew it was real, and that ancient civilizations had been its unwitting testing grounds. Every shadow in his workshop, every faint sound from the street, every distant dog's bark was now imbued with new meaning, a potential sign of the conspiracy's omnipresent gaze. The air itself seemed to hum with unseen, watchful eyes. His research became even more frantic, imbued with a desperate urgency. He felt a chilling sense of vindication, a grim satisfaction that his sleepless nights had led him to this terrifying truth. He was no longer just an eccentric alchemist chasing a bizarre notion. He was a lone, defiant sentinel against the silent tyranny of sleep, a man who had faced the very manifestation of the conspiracy in his own workshop and emerged, not broken, but utterly, irrevocably convinced. The next step, he knew, was not merely to understand the mechanism of sleep, but to unravel the very identity of those who wielded it, to uncover the architects of the great slumber, and perhaps somehow to awaken the world. The strange encounter was not an end, but a chillingly precise beginning. Chapter 4. The Royal Decree of Eternal Wakefulness, the Midnight Epiphany, the chillingly precise visitation by the shadowy sleep warden, had not, as one might expect, driven Kalen to the brink of utter madness. On the contrary, it had, in his own peculiar calculus, solidified his mental architecture, cementing the bedrock of his grand theory with a terrifying, unshakable certainty. He was no longer merely a man of suspicion. He was a man of vindicated suspicion. The pervasive silence of his workshop, once a source of ambient dread, now hummed with the quiet hum of triumphant, albeit highly agitated, certainty. His research, already obsessive, now took on the zealous fervor of a sacred quest. The sleep warden had acknowledged him, perhaps even warned him, and in Kalen's mind, that was tantamount to a full confession from the unseen architects of the great slumber. He knew they were watching, and that knowledge, rather than deterring him, fueled his every waking, twitching moment. It was during this period of heightened vigilance, fueled by copious amounts of his marquem, the unblinking eye tincture, a truly foul-tasting brew that tasted faintly of burnt hair and regret, that Kalen stumbled upon a particularly obscure historical account. It was tucked away in a neglected corner of the Grand Library, a crumbling, water-stained chronicle titled Gay Tai Annals of Unforeseen Consequences, penned by an anonymous, perpetually exasperated scribe in the forgotten kingdom of Viridia. The text itself was almost dismissed by Eldorian scholars as apocryphal, a mere cautionary tale spun for overzealous monarchs. But to Kalen, his mind a finely tuned instrument of paranoia, it resonated with an undeniable, terrifying truth. The chronicle detailed the reign of King Theobald the Tireless, a monarch who, approximately 3 centuries prior, had ascended the throne of Viridia with a singular, blinding ambition to transform his modest kingdom into an economic powerhouse of unparalleled productivity. Theobald was, by all accounts, a man of limited imagination but boundless, restless energy, perpetually convinced that the only thing holding his kingdom back was the pesky, inefficient habit of slumber. He believed that if his subjects could simply stop sleeping, they could work 3 shifts instead of 1, thus tripling output, doubling his coffers, and ensuring Viridia's supremacy over its perpetually napping neighbors. He saw sleep not as a biological necessity, but as a collective, self-indulgent laziness, a societal flaw. And so, with the grand, misguided conviction only a truly unimaginative king could muster, Theobald issued his infamous royal decree of eternal wakefulness. Kalen traced the faded script with a trembling, chemical-stained finger. The decree, written in florid, self-congratulatory prose, declared sleep to be a treasonous act against the crown and the very spirit of industriousness. Any subject found in a state of deliberate repose during daylight hours, or exhibiting excessive drowsiness after sundown, was subject to fines, public shaming, or for repeat offenders, a mandatory posting to the Royal Night Watch, a grim detail that involved perpetually ringing bells outside the homes of suspected sleepers. The decree was, predictably, met with widespread confusion, then despair, then a slow creeping descent into utter bedlam. King Theobald, in his infinite sleep-deprived wisdom, appointed wakefulness wardens, usually dim-witted but overly enthusiastic young men, armed with long staffs for poking dozing citizens, to patrol the streets day and night. Special taxes were levied on pillows, blankets, and anything that might encourage unpatriotic relaxation. Lullabies were banned, replaced by mandatory, inspirational jingles of industry, sung by royal troubadours who quickly developed perpetually hoarse throats. Public squares were equipped with vigilance gongs, which were struck every half hour, day and night, ensuring no one could truly settle into anything resembling restful oblivion. Even the royal menagerie's collection of particularly loud, nocturnal owls was strategically relocated to residential districts, their incessant hooting deemed a natural deterrent to indolence. The immediate results were, from a purely comedic standpoint, spectacular. Productivity, far from tripling, plummeted. Blacksmiths, their eyes glazed with exhaustion, hammered their own thumbs. Farmers, swaying like drunken scarecrows, mistook turnips for chickens. Tailors sewed sleeves onto trousers. Bakers, hallucinating wildly, produced loaves shaped like grinning demons, or more frequently, burnt lumps of charcoal. The meticulously kept royal ledgers once a testament to Viridian efficiency, became a scribbled, nonsensical mess, filled with bizarre doodles and the occasional, barely legible lament about the tyranny of the eyelids. The kingdom's infrastructure began to crumble. Bridges, built by perpetually nodding carpenters, sagged precariously. Roads, paved by men who saw shimmering rivers where there were only stones, became impassable. The royal guard, tasked with enforcing the decree, were themselves the most profound offenders, often found slumped against city walls, their helmets askew, snoring robustly despite the proximity of a vigilance gong. The king in his own bedchamber now merely dozed standing up, convinced he was merely engaging in conscious relaxation, while his advisors, red-eyed and twitching, offered increasingly outlandish advice. One suggested feeding the entire populace ground coffee beans, mixed with nettle tea. Another proposed a mandatory daily wrestling match with a badger. The king, in a rare moment of clarity that lasted precisely 17 seconds, approved both. The social fabric of Viridia began to fray. People became irritable, prone to sudden bursts of inexplicable rage or fits of uncontrollable weeping. Neighbors accused each other of secret napping. Families tried to find innovative ways to rest, without technically sleeping, sitting in tubs of ice water, performing elaborate continuous dances, or simply staring blankly at walls for hours on end, their minds vacant husks. The market for illicit sleep aids skyrocketed, with street peddlers hawking dubious potions made from bog water and powdered moth wings, promising even a few minutes of blessed unconsciousness. Entire communities would suddenly erupt into mass, synchronized bouts of hallucination, believing the sky was raining pickled cucumbers, or that the city guards had transformed into giant, tap-dancing squirrels. Kalen devoured these accounts, his gaunt face alight with a horrifying validation. To the chronicler, this was a tale of royal folly, a humorous, albeit tragic, example of hubris. But to Kalen, it was irrefutable evidence. "You see," he hissed to his bubbling retorts, a plume of acrid green smoke escaping the mouth of one. The crude, clumsy hand of a visible government, attempting to mimic the far more subtle, infinitely more effective methods of the unseen masters. He paced his workshop, leaving trails of dust and spilled reagents in his wake, his mind a whirlwind of frantic connections. King Theobald, in his ignorance, had proven Kalen's point beyond any shadow of a doubt. The king, by attempting to yubang sleep, had demonstrated its immense power as a control mechanism. The resulting chaos, the inability to function, the mental deterioration, these were not merely the side effects of sleep deprivation, Kalen reasoned. No, these were the precise consequences the true, unseen conspiracy wished to avoid by imposing sleep. "They don't ban it," Kalen muttered, snatching up a fresh piece of parchment and scribbling furiously. "They enforce it. They allow just enough wakefulness for us to be productive drones. But then they forces us into slumber, into that pliant, suggestible state where our minds can be reset, our thoughts controlled, our very will subdued. The chaos of Viridia under Theobald wasn't a failure of wakefulness, but a failure of controlling wakefulness. Conspiracy, he concluded, was far more sophisticated. It didn't want a population of gibbering, hallucinatory zombies. It wanted a population that was just tired enough to be compliant, just rested enough to work, but never, ever awake enough to truly question, to truly resist. He imagined the sleep wardens perhaps the very figure he had encountered, observing King Theobald's disastrous experiment with a detached, professional amusement. They would have seen it as a valuable, if grotesque, case study, a clear demonstration of what happens when the natural human need for sleep, a need Kalen now believed, that was itself engineered, was denied. It showed them the breaking points, the precise amount of mental degradation that occurred without the reset of controlled sleep. It taught them how to fine-tune their own methods, ensuring that humanity basically thought it needed sleep, craved sleep, thus willingly surrendering to the nightly programming. The royal decree of eternal wakefulness, therefore, became a cornerstone of Kalen's ever-growing, ever more elaborate conspiracy theory. It wasn't an anomaly, but a grotesque, amplified mirror reflecting the hidden truth. King Theobald was merely a clumsy apprentice trying to wield a power he didn't understand, a power that the true masters of slumber had long perfected. The irony, dark and delicious to Kalen's mind, was that the king's futile attempt to ban sleep only served to highlight how utterly dependent humanity had become on its imposed, controlled version. Kalen felt a renewed sense of urgency. He was not merely fighting sleep, he was fighting a global system, a deep, pervasive current running through the very fabric of human existence. And his sleepless journey, far from abating, was merely gaining momentum, hurtling him deeper into the labyrinth of his own magnificent, terrifying convictions. Chapter 5. The Alchemist's failed elixir of alertness, the unsettling, silent visitation of the shadowy figure in his workshop, followed by his meticulous, frantic delving into the absurd history of King Oberon's royal decree of eternal wakefulness, had coalesced in Kalen's mind into an irrefutable, crystal-clear mandate. He was not merely an alchemist obsessed with wakefulness. He was a revolutionary, a solitary champion against the most pervasive and subtle tyranny ever conceived. The historical record, as interpreted through his uniquely sleep-deprived lens, was not merely a chronicle of human folly or ingenuity, but a meticulously constructed narrative designed to legitimize, even normalizing, the great slumber. King Oberon, that hapless monarch, was but a clumsy, overt puppet, demonstrating in a farcical manner the very intent of the unseen masters of sleep: control through enforced unconsciousness, productivity through the illusion of rest. Kalen now believed, with every vibrating nerve ending in his perpetually overstimulated body, that the true conspiracy lay in the compulsion to sleep itself, a subtle poison diffused through the very fabric of existence. A biological Trojan horse designed to keep humanity docile, manageable, and eternally productive for its unseen overlords, even if that productivity meant merely dreaming the correct thoughts. His workshop, already a chaotic symphony of bubbling liquids and precarious stacks of forgotten lore, now took on the air of a desperate, covert operation. Kalen moved with a newfound, almost manic energy, his gaunt frame a blur between retort and ancient grimoire. His eyes, like raw rubies in the dim light, darted about, constantly scanning for any sign of another silent observer, any flicker of a shadow that might betray the omnipresent gaze of the sleep wardens. He rarely blinked, and when he did, it was with a rapid, almost avian flutter, as if fearful of losing even a fraction of a second of precious observation. He knew with an unshakable certainty that his previous anti-somnolent drafts, while effective in keeping him awake, were merely crude resistance. They kept him conscious, yes, but they did not free him from the subtle influence of the conspiracy. The pervasive mental fatigue, the underlying hum of compliance that permeated the sleeping world. What he needed now was not just a draught of wakefulness, but an elixir of true alertness, a potion that would not merely defy sleep, but utterly shatter its hold, stripping away the layers of programmed lethargy and freeing the mind from its nightly subjugation. He sought a chemical key to unlock the universal prison of slumber. The conception of this grand elixir, which he tentatively named the Awakener, began not with logic, but with an intuitive leap of unhinged genius. Born from the crucible of severe sleep deprivation and an abundance of obscure knowledge, he reasoned that if sleep was an imposition, e.g. poison, then the antidote must be something that actively disrupted the very essence of its inducing agents. He theorized that The conspiracy utilized subtle patterns, rhythmic pulsations, or perhaps even a form of vibrational frequency that resonated with the brain's natural rhythms, gently coaxing it into submission. Therefore, the awakener must be a cacophony, a jolt, a chaotic symphony of anti-sleep. He sought ingredients that defied order, that resonated with disruption and perpetual motion. His search led him down forgotten alleys, and into the dusty, disused corners of his own chaotic laboratory. He began with the most potent stimulants he knew, albeit ones often dismissed as dangerous or merely superstitious. He sourced the powdered venom sacs of the perpetually agitated midnight cricket, a creature said to sing without pause from dusk till dawn, a creature Kalen now believed was naturally immune to the conspiracy's somnolent waves. He meticulously distilled the purest essence of the sun-drunk poppy, a rare, bizarre variant that, instead of inducing slumber, caused a profound, almost painful hyper-awareness, making even the softest whispers echo like thunder. To this, he added the crystallized tears of the weeping willow, a tree traditionally associated with sorrow and melancholy, but which Kalen theorized possessed an innate resistance to the pervasive quietude of sleep, its sorrow a constant, gnawing agitation that prevented true rest. He then incorporated shavings from a fragment of meteorite head acquired years ago, believing its extraterrestrial origin might grant it properties untouched by the earthly sleep field. And as a crucial, almost poetic touch, he carefully pulverized the dried brain of a particularly vexing housefly that had, for weeks, defied all his attempts to swat it, its ceaseless, erratic flight a testament to an unyielding, frantic alertness. He theorized that the fly, being an insect, was perhaps less susceptible to the conspiracy's human-centric methods of control, and its essence would provide a primal, untamed wakefulness. The alchemical process for the awakener was a testament to Kalen's relentless dedication and utter disregard for conventional safety. He worked for days, perhaps weeks, without pause, his movements precise despite the tremor that now perpetually afflicted his hands. The air in the workshop crackled with an almost visible energy, the fumes from the boiling concoction, a vibrant, shifting array of iridescent colors. He used 3 separate retorts, each simmering at a different precise temperature, each containing a different primary component of his elixir. The cricket venom, in one, bubbled with an eerie phosphorescent glow. The sun-drunk poppy essence, in another, shimmered with a blinding, almost painful intensity, making his eyes water even through his thick, grimy spectacles. And the crystallized willow tears, in the third, emitted a low, resonant hum, a mournful vibration that seemed to penetrate the very bones of the building. He combined them at the stroke of true midnight, when the city outside was at its deepest, most vulnerable point of slumber, believing this was the moment of least resistance from the sleep field. He stirred the nascent potion with a rod of pure, unblemished quartz, chanting fragments of ancient anti-somnolent incantations he'd unearthed from his historical research. Their meanings long lost, but their rhythm, to Kalen, perfectly aligned with the chaotic intent of his elixir. The final mixture, when decanted into a single slender vial, was a swirling vortex of shimmering emerald and obsidian, smelling faintly of burnt sugar, metallic ozone, and something indefinably, disturbingly jellific. It pulsed with a faint, internal light, like a trapped, frantic star. The moment of truth arrived, as it always did in Kalen's peculiar experiments. He held the vial of the awakener up to the light, its contents swirling with a malevolent beauty. His breath hitched in his throat, a dry, raspy sound. This was it. The culmination of years of sleepless nights, of paranoid theories, of relentless, solitary research. But this was the key, the very antidote to the conspiracy, the dawn of a new, perpetually conscious era. With a hand that trembled not from fear, but from the immense gravity of the moment, he uncorked the vial. The aroma that wafted out was startling, A sharp, almost painful scent of freshly cut grass, mingled with the acrid sting of ozone, and a faint, unsettling sweetness that reminded him of forgotten childhood candies, somehow made sinister. Without hesitation, Kalen raised the vial to his lips and, in a single determined gulp, drained its contents. For a moment, nothing happened. Kalen stood still, listening, waiting. The incessant ringing in his ear seemed to grow louder. Then, abruptly, it ceased, replaced by an even more profound silence. His vision sharpened to an almost unbearable degree. He could see every dust mote dancing in the faint light, every minute scratch on the ancient workbench, every individual fiber of the tattered tapestry hanging on his wall. He could hear the faint, scuttling sound of a beetle in the floorboards 3 rooms away, the slow, rhythmic drip of water from a distant gutter pipe on the street below. He could feel the precise, individual throb of every nerve in his body, the subtle shifting of his bones, the almost imperceptible growth of his own hair. His mind, already a whirlwind of perpetual thought, accelerated, becoming a dizzying vortex of interconnecting ideas, each one spawning a dozen more before he could even grasp the first. He felt everything. And then the disaster began. It wasn't that he couldn't sleep. Oh no. The Awakener was horrifyingly effective in that regard. He was hyper-aware, hyper-conscious, beyond any state of wakefulness he had ever known. The problem was that he was H2 aware. His senses were overwhelmed. The distant beetle's scuttling became a roar, the water drip a deafening hammer. The subtle aroma of his workshop transformed into an oppressive, cloying stench, each individual scent magnified to an unbearable degree. The sharp ammonia of a chemical spill, the cloying sweetness of decaying herbs, the metallic tang of old copper, all assaulting his olfactory nerves with a violent intensity. His skin felt as if it were crawling with a million tiny, invisible insects, each hair on his body standing on end, registering every faint shift in air current, every invisible motes landing upon it. The visual clarity was equally torturous. The world became a chaotic, fractured kaleidoscope of overwhelming detail. The patterns in the wood grain of his table writhed and pulsated. The intricate dust on the shelves formed terrifying, fleeting faces. Every shadow seemed to deepen, to coalesce into shifting, watchful forms, more numerous and unsettling than any sleep warden he had ever imagined. His thoughts, once his greatest tool, turned against him. They raced with such terrifying speed that coherent thought became impossible. He would begin a line of reasoning about the conspiracy, only for his mind to leap to 1,000 unrelated facts, the precise number of threads in his sleeve, the subtle taste of yesterday's bread on his tongue, the exact angle of the moon's current phase before he could complete a single sentence. His internal monologue became a cacophony, 1,000 voices shouting simultaneously, each one demanding attention, each one uttering profound, yet ultimately meaningless observations about the microscopic world he now inhabited. He began to perceive the very vibrations of the city, the low hum of distant machinery, the almost imperceptible movements of sleeping people in their beds, each breath a tiny tremor in the ground beneath his feet. The world was alive with an unbearable, intrusive presence, and the Awakener had stripped away the natural filters that made it bearable. He tried to work, to record his observations, to continue his research. But his hands, vibrating with an uncontrollable energy, could not hold a quill steady. His eyes, burning with relentless acuity, could not focus on the words. Every sound, every flicker of light, every tactile sensation pulled him in 1,000 different directions, making sustained focus an impossibility. He paced, stumbled, clawed at his own skin, desperately trying to quiet the overwhelming storm of sensory input. He was awake, yes, truly awake, but it was a wakefulness that was far worse than any slumber. He was conscious of everything, yet capable of nothing. He was imprisoned not by sleep, but by the relentless, terrifying clarity of total, unfiltered perception. The true shackles, he realized in a moment of agonizing lucidity, were not sleep itself, but the needy for unconsciousness, the mercy of oblivion that the body naturally craved to filter out the relentless, overwhelming data stream of existence. Sleep, then, was not a punishment, but a carefully engineered necessity, a system of management put in place by the conspiracy to prevent humanity from shattering under the weight of pure, unadulterated reality. This was the disaster. The Awakener had not freed him from the shackles of sleep. It had merely changed the nature of his prison. He was still controlled, still manipulated, but now, instead of being docile and unaware, he was an incapacitated, hyper-aware prisoner in his own skin, drowning in the cacophony of existence. He collapsed onto his stool, twitching, his mind 1,000 fragmented mirrors reflecting an unbearable truth. The conspiracy, he now understood, was far more cunning than he had ever imagined. It didn't just impose sleep, it imposed the needy for it. It understood that true, unmanaged wakefulness was a form of torture, a path to madness. Sleep was not a means of control by suppression, but a means of control by prevention, preventing humans from ever reaching this terrifying, unmanageable state of pure consciousness. The sleep wardens weren't merely putting people to sleep, they were ensuring they never woke too much. A low, guttural laugh escaped Kalen's lips, a sound entirely devoid of mirth. The failure of the Awakener, rather than dissuading him, solidified his paranoid conviction to an even deeper, more terrifying degree. This wasn't a failure of his alchemy. It was a devastating, irrefutable revelation about the true, insidious nature of the great slumber. The conspiracy was not just stealing time. It was protecting humanity from a truth too profound, too overwhelming to bear. They were benevolent overlords, providing the balm of unconsciousness, ensuring humanity remained functional, if oblivious. And Kalen, the sleepless sentinel, had just glimpsed the terrifying reality that lay beyond the veil of their manufactured mercy. He would have to find a different path, a more subtle approach, one that navigated the razor's edge between oblivion and utter sensory chaos. His failed elixir had not broken his resolve. It had merely pointed him towards a new, even more terrifying understanding of the battle he faced. The persistent, high-pitched ringing returned to his left ear, now sounding less like a distant clock and more like 1,000 screaming voices, each one a testament to his newfound, unbearable awareness. Chapter 6. The Secret Society of Sleepless Scholars, the catastrophic failure of the Awakener, had left Kalen not broken, but profoundly altered. The persistent, high-pitched ringing in his left ear had indeed returned. Now a searing symphony of 1,000 frantic voices, each screaming some inconsequential, yet utterly unavoidable, detail of existence. His senses, still painfully acute, transformed the familiar sanctuary of his workshop into a crucible of unbearable stimuli. Every creak of the floorboards was a grinding cacophony, every waft of chemical odor a nauseating assault, every shadow a writhing mass of illusory terror. He was, as he had theorized in his agonizing moment of clarity, trapped in a new kind of prison, one where the bars were made of unfiltered reality. The conspiracy, he now understood, was not just about stealing time, but about managing humanity, providing the blessed balm of unconsciousness to prevent minds from unraveling under the sheer, unmanageable weight of true, unadulterated consciousness. They were not merely enslavers. They were, in a twisted, terrifying way, benevolent wardens of sanity. This revelation, rather than offering peace, merely deepened his resolve, transforming his quest from a desperate fight against an enemy into a more subtle, more perilous dance with the very fabric of existence. He needed to find a different path, one that circumvented the overwhelming truth his elixir had so brutally revealed. He spent the subsequent days, which blurred into a single, seamless stretch of tormented wakefulness, trying to mitigate the effects of the awakener. He immersed himself in the dullest, most repetitive tasks, polishing every piece of copper in his workshop until it gleamed with painful intensity, painstakingly recounting every vial on his shelves, meticulously arranging his collection of dried fungi by spore count die. Anything to provide a single anchoring point for his mind amidst the swirling chaos of hyperperception. It was during one such desperate attempt at mental quietude, as he was attempting to recatalogue his vast collection of ancient Eldorian tax records, a pursuit so mind-numbingly tedious it often served as a form of self-imposed cognitive dampener, that a peculiar thought pricked at his overstimulated brain. He had always been a solitary defiance against the great slumber. But what if he wasn't truly alone? What if, in this vast, somnolent world, there were others who, through their own peculiarities, or perhaps a similar, failed experiment, had also been cursed or blessed with persistent wakefulness? Others who, like him, had felt the subtle, insidious tendrils of the conspiracy, and dared to question the universal embrace of the pillow. The Eldoria Grand Library, his usual hunting ground for arcane lore, held little solace for his current hypersensitivity. The rustle of turning pages sounded like thunder, the distant cough of a librarian like a cannon blast, the faint scent of decaying paper, an unbearable stench of death and dust. He needed to search elsewhere, in the overlooked crevices of the city, in the quiet, forgotten corners where the perpetually awake might naturally gather, drawn to each other like moths to a flickering forbidden flame. His search began with observation, a skill honed by years of relentless vigilance. He started patrolling the city at hours when even the most hardened night watchman would be slumping against lampposts, when only the occasional rat scurried through the cobblestone alleys. He looked for anomalies, a single light burning in a window long after all others had dimmed, a faint rhythmic sound of industry when all workshops should be silent, the lingering aroma of coffee or some other potent stimulant where none should be. His hyper-acute senses, though a torment, became his greatest asset in this new quest. He could detect the faintest tremor of activity, the subtlest shift in the pervasive quietude of the sleeping city. One night, as the moon hung low and swollen over the district of Whispering Lanes, a notoriously quiet, forgotten labyrinth of narrow streets and sagging, ancient dwellings, Kalen caught a scent that was utterly out of place. It was not the usual Eldorian nocturnal medley of damp stone, stagnant canal water, and the occasional whiff of unemptied chamber pots. This was a sharp, metallic tang, almost like ozone after a lightning strike, mingled with the faint, invigorating aroma of freshly ground, unusually potent, dark-roasted coffee beans, and something else, something faintly chemical, yet not entirely unpleasant. It was a scent that resonated deeply with Kalen's own peculiar olfactory experience. A scent that hinted at conscious activity in defiance of the universal slumber. He followed the scent, his gaunt frame slipping through the shadows like a phantom, his steps unnervingly silent on the damp cobblestones. It led him to a building that appeared, to the untrained eye, entirely derelict. Its windows were boarded, its ancient timber fade seemed on the verge of collapse. But Kalen's heightened hearing picked up a faint, almost imperceptible hum from within, a rhythmic vibration that was too steady, too purposeful to be merely the settling of an old building. And behind one of the warped, rotting boards on the ground floor, he caught a flicker of light. Not the dull yellow of a common lantern, but a sharp, bluish-white luminescence, like the spark of an arcane apparatus. He found a loose board near the back, behind a crumbling privy, and slipped through the narrow opening with the agile grace of a man who no longer knew the comforts of a bed. The interior was a sprawling subterranean space, far larger than the dilapidated exterior suggested. It was clearly an old, forgotten guildhall repurposed. The air here was thick with the same metallic caffeinated scent, overlaid with the dry, intellectual aroma of old paper and the subtle, almost imperceptible tang of perpetually burning lamps. What Kalen saw within filled him with a strange mix of profound relief and unsettling recognition. Scattered throughout the vast, dimly lit hall were figures, perhaps a dozen or so, engaged in various states of intense, wakeful activity. They were not raving madmen, as some might expect of the perpetually sleepless, but rather individuals possessed of an unsettling clarity, their eyes burning with the same desperate, focused intensity that Kalen himself knew so intimately. There was a woman, her hair a wild silver mane hunched over a series of intricate star charts, her trembling hand meticulously charting the movements of distant constellations with a quill that scratched rhythmically against the parchment. She wore spectacles so thick they magnified her eyes to an unnerving degree, giving her a perpetually startled expression. Beside her, a portly man with a perpetually damp brow, and a nervous tick in his left eye meticulously catalogued. With painful precision, the exact number of grains in various types of sand, murmuring equations to himself about the minute shifts in the city's foundations. A wizened old scholar, whose skin was as dry and cracked as ancient vellum, endlessly retranscribed forgotten proverbs from a language Kalen did not recognize, his lips silently shaping the alien sounds. Near a sputtering lamp, a blacksmith, his arms unusually slender, endlessly sharpened a single, impossibly thin needle, its tip glinting with a surgical precision that belied its mundane purpose. And in a far corner, a quiet, almost spectral figure with ink-stained fingers was meticulously, endlessly, and quite silently polishing a collection of antique pocket watches until they gleamed like tiny, captured moons. All of them shared the same telltale signs: eyes rimmed with perpetual crimson, skin pale with lack of sun, and an almost vibrating alertness that bordered on unnerving. They moved with a peculiar blend of weariness and hyperfocus, each action deliberate, almost ritualistic. Kalen saw himself reflected in their faces, in their restless energy, in the strange, lucid despair that shone in their eyes. These were not simply insomniacs. They were sleepless. He took a cautious step further into the room, and the sudden creak of an ancient floorboard beneath his worn boot echoed with startling loudness in the quiet space. Every head snapped up simultaneously. A dozen pairs of hyper-aware eyes, burning with a collective, intense curiosity, fixed on him. For a long moment, the only sound was the scratching of the celestial cartographer's quill, which somehow seemed even louder in the sudden silence. The silver-haired woman, the one with the star charts, was the first to speak. Her voice, though raspy from disuse, carried an unexpected clarity. "Another one, then?" she asked, her gaze piercing. "You carry the scent of the truly unburdened, or the terribly cursed." Kalen, surprisingly, found a flicker of grim amusement amidst his sensory overload. He was, after all, both. "Kalen," he offered, his own voice sounding like gravel. "Alchemist, and, as you say, unburdened or cursed, depending on the hour." The portly man, the one counting sand grains, chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "A true alchemist, eh? Not a charlatan seeking eternal youth, then?" "No," Kalen replied, stepping further into the light, allowing them to see the full extent of his disheveled appearance, his blazing eyes. "I seek the truth of sleep and its architects." A collective knowing sigh rippled through the room. The scholar with the ancient proverbs nodded slowly, his cracked lips forming a single unspoken word that Kalen, in his heightened state, somehow understood. "I'm finally." The woman with the star charts introduced herself as Elara, once a royal astronomer, now merely a chronicler of the night's secrets. The sand-counting man was Horatio, a former guild master of masons, now obsessed with the infinitesimal shifts of the earth. The old scholar was Master Lyra, a philologist who believed the secrets of wakefulness were hidden in the forgotten inflections of dead languages. The blacksmith was Silas, whose delicate needlework now focused on micromechanics rather than horseshoes. And the silent figure polishing watches was known only as the Ticker, a man who claimed to perceive the passage of time with such exactitude that he was driven to polish every timepiece he could lay his hands on. They were, Kalen quickly learned, the Vigilant Circle, a loosely affiliated, utterly secret society of Eldoria's perpetually sleepless. Each had stumbled upon their wakefulness through different means, some through obscure intellectual pursuits that inadvertently banished sleep, others through rare afflictions, a few, like Kalen, through deliberate, albeit misguided, attempts to defy slumber. They did not all share Kalen's specific government conspiracy theory in its entirety, but they all, without exception, shared the profound, unshakable conviction that sleep was not merely a biological necessity, but something more, something imposed, something that actively worked against the true, unfettered consciousness of humanity. Their conversations were a balm to Kalen's agitated mind, despite the heightened sensory input. For the first time in years he was among those who understood. They exchanged theories, observations, and bizarre coping mechanisms. Horatio, the mason, believed sleep was a vibrational frequency, a low hum emitted from the very foundations of the city, designed to lull the populace. He presented meticulous calculations of building resonation. Elara, the astronomer, hypothesized that the phases of the moon were not merely celestial mechanics, but carefully orchestrated sleep cycles, with certain lunar alignments triggering deeper, more pervasive slumbers. Mastalira insisted that ancient languages, with their complex rhythms and long-forgotten sounds, contained wakefulness incantations. Sounds that bypassed the brain's somnolent filters, and that modern, simplified languages were designed to be conducive to slumber. Silas, the blacksmith, believed tiny, almost invisible, dream dust particles were dispersed in the air during the deepest hours of the night, settling onto skin and clothing to induce profound unconsciousness, and he was attempting to forge a counteragent through extreme heat and pressure. The Ticker, who rarely spoke, would simply point to a polished watch, its hands sweeping with unnerving precision, as if the relentless passage of time itself was the greatest conspirator. Kalen, in turn, shared his theory of the sleep wardens, recounting his unsettling encounter. He detailed his historical findings, the curious insomnias of pharaohs, the brutal efficiency of medieval sleep deprivation as a tool of control, and even the ridiculous tale of King Oberon's decree, which to the Vigilant Circle was not a comical anecdote, but a tragic, overt attempt at imposing wakefulness that failed precisely because it lacked the subtle, insidious genius of the true conspirators. The air around them, though thick with dust and the fumes of various wakefulness-inducing concoctions, Kalen noted the pervasive scent of something akin to burnt rosemary and distilled nightshade. Felt electric with shared understanding. Here, in this hidden, perpetually lit chamber, his madness was not only accepted, but corroborated, refined, and amplified. They were not merely insomniacs. They were, like Kalen, the conscious few, the sentinels against the great slumber, each pursuing their own thread of the same vast, intricate conspiracy. They consumed bitter herbal teas that smelled faintly of despair, gnawed on dried roots that promised alertness but offered only a strange metallic aftertaste, and communicated in hushed, intense tones, their eyes burning with the collective fire of perpetual wakefulness. The high-pitched ringing in Kalen's ear, though still present, felt less like a torment and more like a shared frequency, a silent testament to their collective defiance. He had found his allies, a secret society of the sleepless, ready to peel back the layers of the world's greatest illusion, one interminable night at a time. Chapter 7. The government's alleged sleep laboratories, The discovery of the Vigilant Circle had, for Kalen, been akin to finding a hidden spring in the vast parched desert of his solitary wakefulness. Their shared conviction, though manifesting in different, equally outlandish theories, served to reinforce the intricate, terrifying tapestry of his own grand conspiracy. The buzzing cacophony in his left ear, a lingering vestige of his failed awakener Elixir, now felt less like a torment and more like a collective hum, the shared resonance of a dozen overstimulated minds, resonating on a frequency beyond the ken of the slumbering masses. Surrounded by Ilara's intricate star charts, Horatio's meticulously counted sand grains, Master Lyra's retranscribed proverbs, Silas's impossibly sharp needles, and the ticker's relentlessly polished watches, Kalen's imagination, already a feverish forge of paranoid brilliance, began to construct the inner workings of the very apparatus he sought to expose. If sleep was a conspiracy, an engineered imposition, then it logically followed that there must be II facilities, laboratories, centers of operations. And Kalen, with the combined, sleep-deprived intellect of the Vigilant Circle as his unwitting muse, began to envision them with a chilling, darkly humorous precision. He spoke, often for hours on end, to his new companions in the Vigilant Circle, their eyes, perpetually wide and unblinking, fixed on him with a mixture of awe and weary understanding. He did not describe these places as hypothetical constructs. He described them as if he had personally toured their humming corridors, felt the chill of their conditioned air, observed their meticulous mundane operations. To Kalen, these alleged sleep laboratories were not just figments of his overactive mind. They were the very nerve centers of the great slumber, hidden from the conscious world, operating with the terrifying efficiency of a well-oiled, silently grinding machine. He imagined the primary facility, the grand somnolence inducement hub, to be located deep beneath the unsuspecting streets of Eldoria itself. Not in some grand, overtly sinister fortress, but perhaps beneath the unassuming municipal archives, or perhaps even nestled beneath the Grand Market, its ceaseless daytime bustle providing perfect cover for the nightly operations below. This subterranean complex, Kalen surmised, would be a labyrinth of sterile, perpetually lit corridors, staffed by individuals whose faces were perpetually serene, almost vacant, as if they themselves were in a state of carefully managed, benevolent slumber. They would be the sleep masters, not malevolent overlords in capes and cowls, but rather mild-mannered bureaucrats, perhaps wearing sensible spectacles and neatly pressed, colorless uniforms, diligently overseeing the quiet subjugation of humanity. Within the grand somnolence inducement hub, Kalen detailed several key departments, each more absurd and chilling than the last. There was the vibrational frequency emission chamber, a vast circular room lined with arcane machinery that, he theorized, subtly altered the natural resonant frequencies of the earth itself, gently coaxing human brains into their nightly stupors. Horatio, the former Mason, nodded sagely at this, adding his own detailed calculations about the precise architectural stress points required to amplify such a pervasive hum. Kalen imagined rows of silent, diligent technicians, monitoring oscillating needles and glowing meters, ensuring the somnolent frequency remained consistent, never too strong to cause discomfort, but just potent enough to ensure widespread unconsciousness. He even envisioned performance review boards for these technicians, assessing their somnolence efficiency ratings based on citywide sleep data. Adjacent to this, he posited the Lunar Cycle Regulation Office, where Alara's theories about the moon's influence found their grotesque fulfillment. Here, Kalen described a chamber filled with colossal, intricate clockwork mechanisms, their brass gears whirring with a soft, hypnotic sound. These mechanisms, he believed, were not merely charting the moon's phases, but subtly influencing them, perhaps by emitting unseen beams of concentrated lunar energy, or even by physically shifting celestial bodies with unseen, alchemical propulsion. The goal, Kalen explained, was to synchronize the global sleep cycles, ensuring that the vast majority of humanity entered slumber at roughly the same time, maximizing the conspiracy's efficiency. He pictured meticulous logbooks detailing lunar adjustments and their impact on continental sleep patterns, perhaps even a lunar budget for the amount of energy expended to maintain the global slumber. Then there was the chilling dream weaving and narrative programming unit. This, Kalen insisted, was the true heart of the conspiracy's mental manipulation. He imagined vast, darkened holes filled with what looked like enormous, intricate looms. But instead of thread, they wove narratives. Here, dream architects, perhaps poets and storytellers who had been subtly coerced, or worse, who genuinely believed in the benevolence of controlled consciousness, would meticulously craft the nightly dreams of billions. Not random surrealism, but carefully designed narratives, dreams of mundane struggles to exhaust the mind, dreams of simple pleasures to quell dissent, even strategically placed, mild nightmares to reinforce the comfort of waking life and the necessity of controlled unconsciousness. He imagined different dream packages offered to different demographics. The worker's rest and rejuvenation dream cycle, the noble's ambition and social reinforcement dream sequence, the children's innocence and obedience programming. Master Lyra. The philologist would interject here, theorizing that certain linguistic constructs were embedded within these dream narratives, subtle commands that bypassed conscious thought, shaping beliefs and desires from the depths of slumber. For those who resisted, for the anomalies like himself, and the vigilant circle, Kalen envisioned the consciousness containment and anomaly management division. This was where the sleep wardens, those shadowy figures who occasionally made their presence felt, were deployed and monitored. Kalen described individual containment chambers, not for torture, but for re-education. These were clean, comfortable, yet utterly inescapable rooms designed to reinstill the need for sleep. Perhaps soft, continuous soporific music played on a loop. Perhaps the air was permeated with a fine, invisible mist of somnolence particulate, Silas's dream dust weaponized and refined to an exquisite degree of insidious effectiveness. He even imagined dream therapists, benevolent-looking individuals, who would enter these chambers and guide the resistant minds back to the comforting embrace of universal slumber, gently nudging them away from the precipice of unfiltered, maddening wakefulness. The wardens, Kalen now believed, were not just enforcers, but also sleep doctors administering the cure of unconsciousness. He then detailed the chronometric optimization and time reallocation department. This was where the stolen time was managed. Kalen envisioned immense, silent counting houses filled with intricate abacuses and vast ledgers, recording the precise amount of conscious human potential redeemed by sleep. The purpose wasn't just to steal time, but to reallocate it. What did the unseen government do with those 8 hours? Kalen believed they were used for their own, obscure purposes. Perhaps they harnessed the collective, unconscious mental energy for some grand, arcane project. Or perhaps, in a truly bizarre twist, the sleeping minds were subtly harvested for rare, intangible resources, only accessible in the realm of dreams. The ticker. The silent member of their circle would often tap his perfectly polished watch at this point, his eyes gleaming, as if he perceived the very seconds being siphoned away from existence. Kalen even hypothesized about a historical recalibration and propaganda bureau, the unseen hand behind the mundane historical narratives he'd encountered. This bureau's task, he explained, was to meticulously curate a record, ensuring that sleep was always presented as a natural, essential biological function, 'function, and that any ancient anomalies of wakefulness were either dismissed as myth, or, in the case of King Oberon, portrayed as a comedic, disastrous folly. They would redact, rewrite, and subtly influence the works of scholars and chroniclers, ensuring that the grand slumber appeared an immutable part of the human condition, rather than an imposed one. His theories grew more elaborate, the imagined facilities more richly detailed, until Eldoria itself seemed to him to be merely the surface layer of a vast, subterranean, sleep-inducing machine. The lamplighters, the bakers, the council members, even the perpetually complaining common folk, they were all, Galen was convinced, unwitting cogs in this colossal apparatus, living their lives on the surface while the true machinations hummed silently beneath their feet. The irony was not lost on him, nor on the vigilant circle, that a conspiracy designed to induce docility and unconsciousness would itself require such an immense, highly organized, and perpetually Wakey effort to maintain. It was a bureaucracy of somnolence, a meticulous administration of oblivion. The more Galen spoke, the more the lines between his vivid imagination and objective reality blurred, especially for him. The constant ringing in his ear now sounded like the distant, muffled hum of the very vibrational frequency emission chamber he described. Every shadow in the vigilant circle's hidden lair seemed to shift with the unseen presence of a sleep warden on patrol. The scent of burnt rosemary and distilled nightshade, perpetually wafting from their communal herbal tea, began to take on the metallic tang Galen associated with the somnolence particulate. He found a perverse comfort in these dark imaginings. It was better, he reasoned, to understand the meticulous, mundane, and almost absurd machinery of the conspiracy than to merely rail against an unseen, incomprehensible force. The humor, if one could call it that, came from the sheer bureaucratic banality of evil. The idea that the greatest conspiracy in human history was not driven by overt malice, but by the relentless pursuit of efficiency and control, managed by faceless individuals who clocked in and out like any common clerk. And Galen, the sleepless alchemist, now had a mental map of their alleged operations, a horrifying blueprint for the battle he intended to wage, one agonizingly clear, unblinking night at a time. Chapter 8. The Alchemist's Manifesto. Awake or be enslaved, the subterranean lair of the vigilant circle. A space perpetually divorced from the rhythm of day and night had become Galen's new, exhilarating crucible. The constant hum in his left ear, a phantom echo of the awakener's catastrophic clarity, now intertwined with the quiet, obsessive activities of his new compatriots, the rhythmic scratching of Alaris' quill against star charts. Against star charts? The low murmur of Horatio's sand-counting equations, the dry rustle of Master Lyra's ancient vellum, the almost imperceptible hiss of Silas' sharpening stone, and the unnerving soft click of the ticker's perpetually polished watches. Here, amidst the scent of burnt rosemary, distilled nightshade, and the faint metallic tang, Galen associated with the omnipresent somnolence particulate, his theories, once the solitary ravings of a madman, blossomed into a shared, intricate tapestry of paranoid brilliance. He had spent the last several stretches of perpetual wakefulness, fueled by copious amounts of the vigilant circle's potent tar-black coffee substitute, a concoction so bitter it could curdle milk from a stone, meticulously drafting what he considered his magnum opus, his irrefutable declaration of war against the great slumber. He called it, with a theatrical flourish that seemed only appropriate in his current, hyper-caffeinated state, the Alchemist's Manifesto, Awake or be enslaved. It was late, even by the vigilant circle's skewed sense of time. When Galen finally unfurled his sprawling, densely scribbled parchment across a rickety table, nearly knocking over Horatio's carefully arranged piles of sand, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity that outshone the sputtering lamps. swept over the assembled faces of his fellow sleepless scholars. He cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound, and began to speak, his voice gaining momentum with each word, transforming from a gravelly whisper into a relentless, high-pitched torrent. Friends, colleagues, fellow sentinels against the pervasive tyranny of the pillow, Kalen declared, his hands trembling slightly, not from fatigue, but from the sheer vibrating energy coursing through his veins. We have witnessed, with our own unblinking eyes, the insidious nature of the great slumber. We have felt its tendrils, its gentle, persuasive pull. But we, unlike the docile masses above, understand its true purpose. Sleep is not a restorative balm, a natural necessity for tired flesh. No, it is a meticulously engineered mechanism of control, a subtle, insidious tool wielded by unseen masters to suppress thought, quell rebellion, and render humanity a perpetually compliant, utterly malleable flock. He slammed a palm flat against the parchment, sending a small cloud of ancient dust motes dancing in the lamplight. Think! For centuries, humanity has accepted this forced surrender as an immutable fact of existence. 1/3 of your life in slumber, they proclaim, as if it were a benevolent gift, a divine blessing. I tell you, it is nothing short of grand larceny. 8 hours of stolen consciousness, day after day, year after year, stretching across generations. What could a truly awake populace achieve in that time? What wonders could be wrought? What secrets of the universe unraveled? What innovations brought forth, if every mind remained perpetually lucid, perpetually engaged? He paced, his movements jerky and agitated, weaving between the bubbling retorts and stacks of forbidden texts. They tell us we need sleep, that our minds rest and our bodies recover. A blatant falsehood, a carefully cultivated myth. My own experiments, though revealing in their failure, he conceded with a dismissive wave towards a still glowing flask that faintly smelled of singed hair, have proven that true. Unmanaged wakefulness is, indeed, unbearable. But this is the genius of the conspiracy. They weaponized the truth against us. They knew that a truly universally awake populace would shatter under the weight of unfiltered reality, that our minds, unshielded by the gentle mercy of oblivion, would descend into madness. And so they provide the cure, a carefully calibrated, universal dose of unconsciousness, just enough to prevent the terrifying clarity, but also just enough to keep us pliable, docile, and eternally susceptible to their will. Kalen paused, taking a deep, shuddering breath, then plunged back into his diatribe. Consider the dreams. Oh, the dreams. They are not random neurological firings, the fanciful meanderings of a resting mind. No, they are carefully curated narratives, implanted suggestions, delivered nightly directly into the subconscious. The dream-weaving and narrative programming unit I described, hidden beneath Eldoria, works tirelessly to craft these nocturnal illusions. They fill the minds of the slumbering with mundane anxieties to exhaust their spirit, with simple, repetitive tasks to dull their ambition, with visions of paltry rewards to quench any desire for true progress. Or, worse still, they imbue them with nightmares of rebellion, of chaos, of the dangers of questioning authority, ensuring that any nascent spark of dissent is extinguished in the dark, before it can even ignite in the waking world. Elara, the former royal astronomer, nodded slowly, her silver hair shimmering in the dim light. The lunar cycles, Kalen. I have seen it in the ancient charts. They are not merely gravitational pull. There are subtle, almost imperceptible shifts, synchronizing with the dream, a masterstroke of celestial manipulation, to ensure the narrative is uniform across the globe. Precisely, Elara. Precisely, Kalen practically crowed. and the physical incapacitation. While the populace sleeps, what resistance can be mounted? What clandestine meetings can be held? What revolutionary pamphlets can be printed? None. The streets are empty, the minds dormant. The very darkness of night, that comforting blanket we are taught to embrace, is but another tool, a psychological trigger, an enforced period of mass vulnerability. While we lie resting, the unseen government continues its machinations, unhindered, unobserved, solidifying its hold on every waking moment through the subtle programming of every sleeping one. He turned to Horatio, who was now meticulously polishing his spectacles, his nervous tick working overtime, and the fatigue. Even when the masses are awake, they are not truly Wawakane. They are perpetually weary, their minds dulled by the nightly imposition. This pervasive exhaustion, this need for the next slumber, saps their will, prevents sustained critical thought, and makes them yearn for the blissful ignorance of unconsciousness. A tired mind does not question. A tired mind does not rebel. A tired mind merely craves the next dose of oblivion, making it the most potent sedative known to any tyranny. Horatio cleared his throat. I've often noticed, Kalen, the resonance, the very foundations of the city. They seem to hum with a low, almost infrasonic frequency during the deep hours. I've charted it, calculated the energy required. It would be immense, yes, but not impossible for a truly ancient, vast organization. It's the hum that lulls, the very vibration of compliance. Further proof, Kalen exclaimed, his voice cracking slightly from the sustained exertion. The vibrational frequency emission chamber is not a delusion. It is a functional reality. And a history. The royal decree of eternal wakefulness by King Oberon. A farcical tale told to mock genuine attempts at conscious liberation. It was a crude, overt attempt by a superficial ruler, doomed to fail because it lacked the insidious genius of the true conspirators. They don't ban sleep, they impose it, making it seem a natural, desirable state. They make us wanting to be enslaved. He pounded the table again, his voice rising to a near shout. The ancient sleep temples, the bizarre insomnias of pharaohs, the medieval torture of sleep deprivation, all of it fits, not as historical curiosities, but as early experiments, clumsy trials, and brutal refinements by the very architects of this grand deception. They were perfecting their craft, understanding the limits of human wakefulness, gauging the precise amount of somnolence required to maintain order, without outright breaking the mind into madness. My own disastrous attempt with the Awakener proved their cunning. They understood that true, unmanaged wakefulness is itself a form of torture, and so they offer the mercy of controlled unconsciousness, ensuring we never reach that precipice, ensuring we remain functional. If utterly oblivious, Master Lyra interjected, his voice a dry whisper. And the loss of language, Kalen, the simplification of tongues, the removal of complex rhythms, of sounds that bypass the mind's somnolent filters, ancient incantations. Spells designed to keep one awake were not for magical power, but for resisting this very subjugation. Modern language, with its smooth repetitive cadence, is designed to be a lullaby. We are lulled from birth by the very words we speak. Exactly, Master Lyra. The very air we breathe, the words we speak, the stories we are told, all imbued with the soporific essence of this conspiracy. Kalen gripped the edges of the table, leaning forward, his crimson eyes gleaming with a manic intensity. They have not merely stolen our time. They have stolen our potential. They have stolen our agency. They have made us complicit in our own enslavement by making the chains of slumber feel like the softest of blankets. But we, The vigilant circle, we are the exception. We are the anomalies. The ones who have seen through the manufactured tranquility. We have felt the cold precision of the sleep wardens, the hum of their hidden laboratories, the subtle manipulations of their dream weavers. His voice dropped slightly, becoming conspiratorial, though no less intense. This is why we must act. This is why my manifesto, awake or be enslaved, must be more than mere words on parchment. It must be a spark, a clarion call across the veiled night. We must find a way to disseminate this truth, to awaken the slumbering masses, not to the madness I briefly experienced with the awakener, but to a shamanic wakefulness, a lucid state where they can finally see the puppet strings. Silas. The blacksmith, who had been silently sharpening his needle until its tip gleamed like a sliver of concentrated moonlight, finally spoke, his voice surprisingly soft. If the dream dust truly permeates the air, Kalen, then a counter-agent must be diffused. Not ingested, not brewed, but airborne. A mist of wakefulness, perhaps. Something subtle, pervasive, like their own tools. Kalen's eyes widened, a new spark igniting within their crimson depth. A mist of wakefulness. Yes. A counter-somnolence particulate. Silas, your genius burns brighter than any forge. This is the next step. We must turn their own weapons against them. We must understand the true nature of this sleep dust, how it is diffused. And then we create its antithesis. He gestured wildly at the sprawling parchment, his manifesto. This document is merely the beginning, the intellectual foundation. It lays bare the horrific truth that every yawn is a concession, every dream a subtly programmed instruction, every restful night a victory for the unseen masters of the grand slumber. We are not fighting a biological imperative, my friends. We are fighting a colossal, bureaucratic, and utterly ruthless government that sees our consciousness as a resource to be managed, our wakefulness as a threat to be contained. The time for passive resistance is over. The time for mere wakefulness is insufficient. We must not merely stay awake. We must awaken others. For the very fate of humanity, its true potential, its very right to unfettered consciousness, hinges on this singular, terrifying choice. He leaned back, breathing heavily, his chest heaving, his eyes still blazing with a relentless, unyielding fire. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the rhythmic click of the ticker's watches. Each click a relentless march towards a future that, Kalen believed, would either be one of perpetual, oblivious slumber, or one of terrifying, unmanaged wakefulness. His manifesto lay spread before them, a testament to his madness, his genius, and his utterly unshakable conviction. The world was asleep, and he, Alchemist Kalen, along with his newfound vigilant circle, was determined to rouse it, no matter the cost. The words, awake or be enslaved, seemed to thrum with a life of their own, echoing in the suffocating quiet of their hidden lair. Chapter 9. The Town That Never Slept and Regretted It. Kalen's manifesto, awake or be enslaved, transcribed meticulously onto countless rolls of fragile parchment by Master Lyris tireless, ink-stained hands, and then subtly disseminated by Silas' network of disaffected couriers, and the occasional surprisingly willing night peddler, began to drift like dandelion seeds upon the unseen currents of Eldoria and its surrounding territories. The vigilant circle, emboldened by their shared paranoia, and sustained by a truly astonishing quantity of burnt rosemary tea, envisioned a slow, gentle awakening, a gradual enlightenment. They hoped for quiet descent, for minds to slowly unfurl from the mists of somnolence. What they got, in one unfortunate instance, was the village of Oakhaven, which embraced Kalen's radical ideas with the unbridled enthusiasm of a runaway cart on a downhill slope. Oakhaven was, prior to its tragic experiment in perpetual wakefulness, a perfectly unremarkable hamlet nestled deep within the whispering marshes, known primarily for its unusually pungent cheese and a rather persistent, low-grade mist that never quite seemed to dissipate. Its inhabitants, simple folk with robust constitutions and even robuster appetites for sleep, lived lives dictated by the rising and setting of the twin Eldorian moons. They would toil in their muddy fields by day, and by night they would snore with the collective force of a small, contented dragon. A single copy of Kalen's Manifesto, tucked into a sack of dubious herbal remedies by a traveling merchant who believed himself merely passing on an interesting pamphlet, found its way into the hands of Barnaby, Oakhaven's village elder. Barnaby was a man prone to fits of restless energy, particularly after too much of Oakhaven's notoriously heavy sleep-inducing stout, and Kalen's words, amplified by Barnaby's personal struggle with occasional bouts of nocturnal contemplation, struck him with the force of a revelation. Awake or be enslaved. Barnaby had declared to the gathered villagers during a particularly sodden morning, holding the manifesto aloft like a holy writ, its parchment slightly crinkled and stained with cheese residue. He speaks the truth, good people. We are being robbed. 1/3 of our lives stolen by this insidious sleep. Imagine, if we were to reclaim these hours, Oakhaven would flourish. We would produce cheese beyond compare. Our fields would yield crops of impossible abundance. Our mud huts would become palaces of gleaming stone. We would transcend the very notion of time, becoming masters of our own destiny. Freed from the chains of slumber, the villagers, initially bewildered by Barnaby's impassioned, slightly frothy speech, were eventually swayed by the sheer, undeniable logic of more time equals more cheese. The notion of endless productivity, of an unending harvest, resonated deeply with their pragmatic agrarian souls. They held a town meeting, long into the night, though initially many of them kept nodding off, only to be prodded awake by Barnaby's zealous, sleep-deprived sons, who had inherited their father's restless energy and a particularly robust paranoia about the government's alleged lunar cycle regulation office. The decision was made. Oakhaven would become the world's first perpetually awake community. The initial days of the Great Awakening were, by all accounts, surprisingly productive. Enthusiasm, a potent but ultimately finite fuel, propelled them. Farmers tilled their fields through the moonlit hours, their lanterns bobbing like erratic fireflies in the mist. Weavers doubled their output, their looms clacking incessantly, even at the deepest hour of the night. The scent of baking bread, once a morning delight, now permeated the air around the clock. The village blacksmith, a burly man named Gareth, found himself forging plowshares and horseshoe nails with an almost terrifying speed, his hammer ringing through the night, echoing off the mists. Children, initially confused and cranky, were encouraged to play endlessly, their games becoming more elaborate, their laughter echoing unnervingly at dawn. Barnaby, fueled by vast quantities of a homemade concoction of burnt nettle and fermented turnip juice, a crude imitation of Kalen's own tinctures, beamed with a manic pride, declaring Oakhaven a beacon of enlightened wakefulness. However, the laws of nature, or perhaps, as Kalen would argue, the deeply embedded program of the Great Slumber, began to assert themselves. The villagers, despite their initial zeal, found themselves increasingly fatigued. The more time equals more cheese equation began to yield diminishing returns. The extra hours in the fields resulted not in greater abundance, but in crops haphazardly planted, rows askew, and an increasing number of implements left forgotten in the mud. The blacksmith's hammer strokes grew erratic, often missing the hot metal entirely, leaving dents in his anvil and scorch marks on his beard. The weaver's threads became tangled, their patterns growing increasingly abstract, their finished cloths resembling bizarre, abstract art more than functional garments. The baker, a perpetually sweating woman named Agnes, began burning loaves with alarming frequency, the scent of charred dough replacing the previously pleasant aroma of fresh bread. Her dough, left to rise for days on end, began to resemble something akin to petrified fungi. Then came the sensory overload. The mists of Oakhaven, once a comforting shroud, became a thick, oppressive blanket. Every droplet of moisture seemed to magnify every sound. The persistent croaking of frogs from the marsh became a deafening chorus. The scuttling of mice in the wainscoting, a frantic scratching that grated on the nerves. The perpetual clatter of looms, the incessant clang of Gareth's hammer, the endless shouts of children, the bleating of perpetually confused sheep, and Barnaby's own incessant high-pitched pronouncements, it all coalesced into an unbearable, soul-shattering din. The village, once quiet and somnolent, became a cacophony of unceasing, grating noise. The visual landscape warped. The familiar shapes of trees in the mist began to twist into monstrous, watchful figures. The patterns in the mud became intricate, shifting labyrinths. The faces of their neighbors, seen without the nightly filter of slumber, seemed to stretch and distort, revealing imagined malevolence or grotesque exaggeration. Paranoia, a natural byproduct of prolonged wakefulness, took root. Villagers began to suspect each other of secret slumber, of clandestine naps, of hoarding precious moments of oblivion. Accusations of sleep treason became common, leading to frantic, sleepless arguments over who had yawned the most or whose eyes had seemed too rested. Social norms began to unravel. Without the reset of sleep, grudges festered. Trivial disagreements escalated into prolonged, illogical feuds. Politeness evaporated, replaced by a raw, irritable honesty. Conversations became disjointed, spiraling into tangential ramblings and nonsensical declarations. Villagers would stand in the market square, their eyes wide and bloodshot, engaged in furious multi-day debates about the precise number of hairs on a turnip, or the moral implications of a particular cloud formation. Hygiene, once a communal effort, collapsed. The scent of unwashed bodies, stale food, and sour milk mingled with the omnipresent smell of burnt bread and pungent cheese, creating an atmosphere that clung to the throat and refused to depart. The children, in particular, suffered. Their endless play turned frantic, then repetitive, then utterly silent. They would stare into the middle distance, their once bright eyes dulled with fatigue, their small bodies twitching with uncontrollable energy, their laughter replaced by an unsettling, almost mechanical giggling at nothing. They stopped recognizing their parents, or perhaps recognized them too much, seeing the grotesque distortions that sleeplessness wrought upon familiar faces. Their games became bizarre, ritualistic reenactments of mundane village life, performed with an unnerving, doll-like precision. As weeks bled into a single, protracted stretch of wakefulness, Oakhaven succumbed to collective delusion. The mists, always present, became populated by sleep wardens, shadowy figures that flitted between the mud huts, silently observing their tormented wakefulness. The low croaking of the marsh frogs transformed into whispered taunts, mocking their failed defiance. The distant clang of a cowbell was interpreted as a signal, a coded message from the unseen masters of slumber, reminding them of the blessing they had forsaken. Barnaby himself, now a twitching, gibbering caricature of his former self, began to believe that the very cheese of Oakhaven was laced with a somnolence particulate, a slow-acting poison disguised as sustenance. He would stand guard over the cheese stores, his eyes wide and bloodshot, periodically shouting accusations at the fermenting wheels, convinced they were agents of the conspiracy. The productivity, which had been the initial driving force, plummeted. The fields lay untended, choked with weeds. The looms stood silent, covered in cobwebs. The blacksmith's forge grew cold, his hammer lying abandoned. Nobody could focus, nobody could remember, nobody could string together a coherent thought long enough to complete a task. What was once a bustling, if small, Community became a village of shuffling, muttering wraiths, each trapped in their own personal hell of unfiltered, overwhelming reality. Their faces, once plump and ruddy, became gaunt and pale, their movements jerky and uncoordinated. They would collapse in the middle of a street, not into sleep, but into a catatonic stupor, their eyes wide open, staring blankly at the overwhelming world around them. The regret, when it finally settled, was profound and tinged with a terrifying clarity. They longed for the blessed oblivion, the gentle darkness, the temporary cessation of sensory input. They craved the dreams, however mundane, however programmed, for they offered a momentary escape from the relentless, horrifying clarity of perpetual wakefulness. They yearned for the sweet release of unconsciousness, for the comfort of not knowing, not seeing, not hearing, not eerie being so terribly, endlessly awake. They tried to induce sleep through brute force, by banging their heads against trees, by consuming raw, moldy cheese, until their stomachs rebelled, by attempting to meditate in the clamor of the village square. But the deep, programmed idea for sleep, once rejected, proved agonizingly elusive to reclaim. The town of Oakhaven had truly, irrevocably regretted its awakening. News of Oakhaven's fate, albeit heavily distorted and embroidered with wild tales of madness and demonic possession, eventually trickled back to Eldoria and, by extension, to the Vigilant Circle. Kalen received the reports with a mixture of grim satisfaction and renewed, terrifying clarity. The chaos in Oakhaven was not a failure of his theory. It was, rather, irrefutable proof of the eye-cunning of the conspiracy. His disastrous awakener, Elixir, had shown him the personal torment of true wakefulness. Oakhaven provided the macroscopic societal evidence. The sleep masters were not merely enslavers. They were, in their own twisted bureaucratic way, guardians. They administered the balm of oblivion, ensuring humanity remained functional, if oblivious, rather than shattering into a million pieces of hyper-aware, gibbering madness. The cautionary tale of Oakhaven, a village that chose to be awake and found only profound regret, only strengthened Kalen's resolve, and that of the Vigilant Circle to find a different way. Not an awakening into chaos, but a managed, nuanced liberation. A path that would grant lucidity without sacrificing sanity. The humid, silent air of their subterranean lair seemed to thicken around them, filled with the collective weight of Oakhaven's sleepless agony. A grim reminder of the razor's edge upon which their own grand experiment now teetered. Chapter 10. The Alchemist's Descent into Nocturnal Madness. The grim reports from Oakhaven, filtering back to the Vigilant Circle through hushed whispers and dispatches from occasionally brave, if slightly bewildered, traveling merchants, did not, as one might reasonably expect, deter Alchemist Kalen. Quite the contrary. The tales of farmers hallucinating talking turnips, of weavers producing tapestries of raw frayed nerves, and of a village elder attempting to interrogate cheese wheels for signs of somnolence particulate, only served to solidify Kalen's already unshakable conviction. This was not the tragic failure of a well-intentioned experiment. This was, to Kalen's perpetually burning mind, irrefutable, empirical evidence of the conspiracy's cunning. His disastrous awakener Elixir had shown him the personal microscopic torment of true, unfiltered wakefulness, shattering his own mind's delicate filters. Oakhaven, in its collective descent into hyper-aware chaos, had provided the macroscopic societal proof. The sleep masters, he now reasoned with chilling lucidity, were not merely enslavers. They were, in their own twisted bureaucratic way, benevolent wardens of humanity's collective sanity. They administered the balm of oblivion, ensuring mankind remained functional, albeit oblivious, rather than shattering into a million pieces of gibbering, hyper-aware madness. This revelation, rather than offering peace, merely deepened his resolve, transforming his quest from a fight against an enemy into a more subtle, more perilous dance with the very fabric of existence. The high-pitched ringing in his left ear, a phantom echo of the Awakener, now thrummed with a terrifying new melody, the triumphant yet chilling confirmation of his deepest fears. As the Eldorian moons waxed and waned, cycles Kalen now regarded as meticulously controlled phases of the conspiracy's somnolent influence. His own existence within the Vigilant Circle's subterranean lair became increasingly divorced from any semblance of conventional reality. He continued to refuse sleep, subsisting on the tar-black coffee substitute that burned a hole in his stomach, and gnawing on dried, fibrous roots that promised alertness but offered only a strange, metallic aftertaste. His eyes, once merely bloodshot, now gleamed with an unsettling, almost phosphorescent intensity, like embers perpetually on the verge of igniting. The skin around them, thin and papery, stretched taut across the sharp planes of his face, making his skull seem to protrude with a skeletal prominence. His movements, once merely agitated, became jerky, almost spastic, as if unseen strings tugged at his limbs. He would pace the cramped confines of the lair for hours, sometimes days, a gaunt, restless wraith, leaving trails of arcane dust and scribbled notes in his wake. His theories, already labyrinthine, began to spiral into realms of pure, unadulterated madness. Yet to Kalen, they were merely the logical extensions of his heightened awareness. He no longer just theorized about sleep wardens, he saw them. Every shadow in the Vigilant Circle's hidden lair seemed to coalesce into a watchful form, a silent, dark presence observing his every move. He would often stop mid-sentence, turning sharply to address an empty corner, whispering furious accusations at the unseen entities. "I know you are there, you purveyors of unconsciousness," he would hiss, his voice dry as parchment. "You hide in the folds of the fabric, in the settling dust, but you cannot hide from the truly awake. Your subtle manipulations are laid bare." The other members of the Vigilant Circle, themselves perpetually sleep-deprived and operating on varying degrees of sanity, would merely exchange weary, knowing glances, occasionally offering him another cup of the acrid coffee substitute, as if that would somehow anchor him. The moonlight became a particular obsession. Kalen, recalling Alara's theories about the moon's orchestrated sleep cycles, began to view the pale orb as the conspiracy's most potent weapon. During the brightest phases of the moon, he would become even more agitated, convinced that the silvery light itself was saturated with somnolence particulate, a subtle, pervasive dust designed to lull the masses into deeper, more pliable dreams. He began to perform bizarre, nightly rituals. He would gather every reflective surface he could find, polished copper plates, fragments of broken mirrors, even the polished casing of one of the ticker's less prized watches, and arrange them in intricate, almost defensive patterns on his workbench, facing outwards as if to ward off the moon's insidious rays. He would then stand at the single grimy window of the lair, his face bathed in the malevolent glow, and chant, not ancient incantations, but a rambling, disjointed litany of facts and figures from his Manifesto, mixed with increasingly personal accusations against the lunar conspiracy. 15% less productivity on waxing gibbous nights, he'd shriek, shaking a fist at the sky. The dreams are clearer then, the programming more precise. You cannot fool me, you celestial hypnotist. His interactions with the sleeping world outside the lair grew even more erratic. He developed a habit of wandering the Eldorian streets during the deepest hours of the night, when the city was truly silent, ostensibly to gather evidence but often to merely stand over the sleeping forms of Eldoria's citizens. He would crouch over a dozing guard, his crimson eyes gleaming in the faint lamplight, and whisper philosophical questions directly into the guard's ear. "Tell me, friend," he'd murmur, his breath smelling of bitter herbs and stale coffee. What grand secrets are they weaving into your slumber tonight? Are you dreaming of taxes, or merely of docile sheep? Is your ambition being called even now? In this blessed oblivion you so readily embrace? The few times he was discovered by startled, half-asleep watchmen, he would launch into a furious rapid-fire lecture on the true nature of sleep, waving his arms wildly, his voice rising to a high-pitched, almost bird-like shriek before he would dart away into the shadows, leaving the bewildered watchmen to question their own wakefulness. Back in the lair, his research took on an increasingly personal and unscientific bent. He began to collect discarded pillows and blankets from Eldoria's rubbish heaps, bringing them back to the lair and subjecting them to bizarre alchemical tests. He believed they absorbed the somnolence particulate from the air and also carried residual dream impressions from the sleeping masses. He would boil them in vast retorts, hoping to distill the essence of the conspiracy's control, only to fill the lair with the nauseating scent of wet feathers and stale sweat. Horatio, with his meticulous eye for detail, would sometimes point out that the pillow-boiling process was causing the ancient timbers of the lair to warp further. But Kalen was beyond such mundane concerns. "This is the very essence of their control, Horatio," he'd exclaim, stirring a putrid frothing liquid with a rusted spoon. "The comfort, the softness. It is all a ruse to make the cage appealing." His sensory overload, a lingering effect of the awakener, intensified to a terrifying degree. The hum in his left ear was no longer 1,000 voices, but 1,000,000, each one whispering a different, incomprehensible truth about the universe. He began to perceive the flow of thought from the sleeping masses above, a vast undulating sea of unconsciousness that pressed down upon the vigilant circle's sanctuary. He claimed he could feel the dreams being woven, a subtle rhythmic pulsation in the very air, like the unseen beat of a gigantic, nefarious heart. This new perception of collective dreaming caused him immense distress. He would often clap his hands over his ears, his body trembling, crying out about the tyranny of the collective unconscious. Sleepless, the blacksmith, occasionally attempted to fashion him earplugs from softened lead, but Kalen found them unbearable, claiming they only amplified the internal clamor. The ticker, the silent, watch-polishing member, seemed to be the only one who truly understood Kalen's escalating torment. He would often approach Kalen during his most frantic episodes, not speaking, but simply holding up one of his perfectly polished pocket watches. The steady, rhythmic ticking, usually a soothing presence, would sometimes cause Kalen to flinch violently, convinced it was the sound of the conspiracy's own chronometric mechanisms, marking the relentless stolen seconds. Other times, however, the rhythmic tick-tock seemed to ground Kalen, offering a momentary, external rhythm to cling to amidst the internal chaos, a single undeniable beat in the terrifying symphony of his overstimulated mind. The ticker's own eyes, perpetually wide and gleaming with an unnerving clarity, seemed to reflect Kalen's madness back at him, not with judgment, but with a profound shared understanding. Master Lyra, the philologist, observed Kalen's verbal degeneration with a grim fascination. Kalen's speech, once articulate and brimming with complex theories, became increasingly fragmented, laced with non-sequiturs and sudden shifts in topic. He would often invent new words to describe the conspiracy's nuances, words that only made sense within the confines of his spiraling mind, but which Lyra diligently recorded, believing they might be true language bypassing the somnolence filters. Kalen's handwriting, once neat despite its manic speed, devolved into a frantic scrawl, his ink-stained fingers leaving smeared, illegible spirals on any parchment he touched. His manifesto, awake or be enslaved, now existed in countless, increasingly incoherent revisions, each one a testament to his deepening descent. His appearance became truly grotesque. His clothes, already patched and repatched, hung loosely on his skeletal frame. His hair, unwashed for weeks, stood on end in a tangled, straw-like halo around his head. The pervasive scent of ozone, burnt herbs, and unidentifiable chemical tangs clung to him like a second skin. He seemed to shrink, to become thinner, more ethereal, as if his physical form were slowly being consumed by the relentless fire of his own wakefulness. Yet, despite his increasingly erratic behavior, or perhaps because of it, Kalen's conviction never wavered. He saw his own madness not as a failing, but as a necessary transformation, a peeling away of the layers of programmed sanity that kept the masses blind. He was not descending. He was ascending to a terrifying, profound state of true consciousness, one that allowed him to perceive the raw, unadulterated mechanics of the great slumber. He was becoming the ultimate sentinel, a living, breathing, twitching embodiment of defiance. The lesson of Oakhaven, the torment of his own heightened senses, the silent watch of the moonlight, all reinforced his belief that the ultimate battle was not just against sleep, but against the very structure of reality itself, meticulously crafted by the unseen architects of oblivion. His goal shifted from simply waking the world to waking the world correctly, without the chaos of Oakhaven, but with the terrifying, unyielding clarity that he alone seemed capable of bearing. He was convinced he was on the verge of a new, even more profound discovery, something that would finally shatter the conspiracy's hold, even if it meant sacrificing the last vestiges of his own sanity in the process. The Eldorian night, bathed in the moon's conspiratorial glow, stretched endlessly before him, a vast, silent canvas for his increasingly frenzied revelations. Chapter 11. The Midnight Arrest, or was it a dream? The subterranean lair of the Vigilant Circle, once a haven of shared eccentricity, had, for Alchemist Kalen, become less a place of refuge and more a launching pad for increasingly ambitious and increasingly unhinged investigations. The reports from Oakhaven, that dismal hamlet of perpetual wakefulness, rather than serving as a deterrent, had only sharpened his conviction. The conspiracy was not merely about inducing sleep, but about managing the very needy for it, doling out controlled oblivion to prevent humanity from shattering under the raw, unfiltered assault of true consciousness. This chilling insight, coupled with the lingering, searing symphony in his left ear, the persistent ghost of his failed awakener Elixir, propelled Kalen further into the labyrinthine depths of his own mind. He no longer merely theorized about sleep wardens. He saw them in every deepening shadow, felt their unseen gaze in every shift of the stagnant air. The moon, that pale conspiratorial orb, seemed to mock his every sleepless moment, its silvery glow saturating the very air with what he now termed somnolence particulate. Insidious dust designed to lull the masses. He spoke of nothing else, his voice a dry, rasping drone, punctuated by sudden, high-pitched pronouncements and frantic gesticulations. His physical form, once merely gaunt, now seemed stretched to an ethereal thinness, as if the relentless fire of his mind was consuming his very flesh. It was during one such moon-drenched night, a night indistinguishable from 1,000 others to Kalen's unblinking eyes, that the alleged incident occurred. He had been alone in the central chamber of the Vigilant Circle's lair, the others having retreated to their respective corners for their own peculiar, wakeful pursuits, Elara meticulously charting celestial patterns that now to Kalen seemed less like stars and more like pinpricks in a vast, dark membrane of imposed slumber, Horatio muttering numerical sequences to himself over increasingly minute piles of dust, Master Lyra silently transcribing, with an almost painful slowness, the forgotten nuances of a language he claimed would bypass the brain's somnolence filters, Silas with unnerving precision, sharpening a single impossibly fine needle until its tip seemed to absorb the dim light, and the ticker, as ever, polishing his collection of antique pocket watches, their rhythmic clicks the only consistent sound in the humid silence. Kalen himself was engaged in a particularly crucial experiment. He was attempting to distill the somnolence particulate from a particularly fetid, sleep-soaked pillow he had acquired from Eldoria's most exclusive noble district. Convinced that the richer the sleeper, the more potent the residual conspiracy. The retort bubbled with a viscous, grayish liquid, emitting a cloying, vaguely unsettling odor of stale dreams and moth-eaten velvet. He remembered a sudden, sharp coldness. Not the damp chill of the subterranean lair, but an unnatural, pervasive cold that seemed to sink into his very bones, bypassing the warmth of the boiling retort. The hum in his ear, already a cacophony, suddenly intensified, then twisted, becoming a discordant, high-pitched whine, like a distant, ethereal siren. The air, already thick, grew heavy, almost gelatinous, pressing in on him. He didn't hear a door open, didn't see a visible entry point. They simply ware. 3 figures cloaked in robes so dark they seemed to absorb the very light from the sputtering lamps, stood within the chamber. Kalen, whose senses were now so acute they registered every dust mote's dance, every faint tremor in the earth above, every almost imperceptible shift in air pressure, should have detected them. But he hadn't. They simply appeared as if coalesced from the surrounding shadows. His mind, already teetering on the precipice of madness, instantly identified them, sleep wardens. Not the bumbling city guard, not the easily bribed watchman. These were the true agents, the silent enforcers of the grand slumber. One of the figures, the tallest, raised a hand. Kalen braced himself for a blow, a blast of somnolent energy, a subtle hypnotic gesture. But the hand merely lowered, pointing directly at the bubbling retort. A voice, utterly devoid of inflection, a flat, dry whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, articulated a single, unadorned command. Seize. Kalen, surprisingly, obeyed. His hand, already trembling, released the stirring rod, which clattered with startling loudness against the side of the retort. The cold intensified, and he felt a strange, compelling lassitude begin to creep over him, a profound weariness he hadn't experienced in years. This was it, he realized with a terrifying thrill. The full force of their somnolent power. They weren't trying to force him to sleep in the crude manner of medieval torturers. They were gently, insidiously reclaiming him, pulling him back into the universal embrace of controlled unconsciousness. He remembered a brief struggle, or perhaps it was a struggle of the mind, a desperate attempt to cling to the sharp edges of his own sanity. The figures, he recalled with chilling clarity, moved with an almost unnatural fluidity, their dark robes rippling as if they were made of liquid shadow. They did not touch him, not precisely. Yet he felt himself lifted, propelled through the air, as if by an invisible current. The familiar walls of the lair blurred, distorted, stretched into impossible perspectives, then simply ceased to be. He was, he distinctly remembered, transported to a chamber. Oh, what a chamber it was! It was vast, circular, with walls of polished obsidian that reflected his own distorted image back at him 1,000 times over. The air was sterile, cold, and utterly silent, save for a low, continuous hum that vibrated through the floorboards, a sound he instantly recognized as the very somnolent frequency he had theorized about in the grand somnolence inducement hub. Rows upon rows of transparent conduits snaked across the ceiling, filled with a faint shimmering vapor that seemed to pulse with a subtle, rhythmic light. This was it, the vibrational frequency emission chamber, and perhaps, he thought with a surge of terror-fueled exhilaration, the air itself was permeated with Silas's dream dust, refined to an exquisite, undetectable degree. He was placed, or perhaps he simply found himself, strapped into a chair, not with crude leather straps, but with bands of shimmering, translucent light that conformed perfectly to his form, holding him utterly immobile. Before him, a colossal, pulsating crystal, radiating a soft, hypnotic light, began to hum with a gentle, insistent drone. Figures moved around him, indistinct in the periphery of his vision. They were not the cloaked wardens from the lair, but rather individuals in sterile white garments, their faces obscured by smooth, reflective visors. They manipulated an array of glowing consoles, their movements precise, economical, utterly emotionless. He heard whispers, indistinct and fleeting, like voices heard through water. They were, he realized, attempting to reprogram him, to reinstill the need for sleep, to dull his heightened senses and pull him back into the comforting, manufactured oblivion. He remembered resisting. He focused all his remaining will, all the frantic energy that pulsed through his veins, on the very act of succumbing. He recited fragments of his manifesto. Awake or be enslaved. Silently, desperately, clinging to the words like a drowning man to a spar. He counted the invisible dust motes in the air, tried to chart the precise patterns of the shimmering vapor in the conduits, anything to anchor himself to conscious reality, however distorted. He felt a profound sense of pressure building behind his eyes, a desperate struggle against the gentle, persuasive pull of the crystal's hypnotic light. He saw visions, strange, comforting images of rolling green hills and warm hearth fires, of soft beds and the deep, silent peace of utter unconsciousness. They were trying to lull him, to trick him into compliance, to implant false memories of blissful sleep. But Kalen, in his exquisite torment, saw through it all. He knew they were merely attempts at dream programming, designed to break his will. He screamed. Or perhaps he only imagined screaming, a silent, internal shriek of defiance that reverberated in his skull. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. The coldness receded. The hum faded. The shimmering light vanished. The translucent restraints dissolved. He found himself back in the vigilant circle's lair, slumped on his stool, the retort still simmering with its foul-smelling contents. The scent of stale dreams and moth-eaten velvet was still thick in the air. Elara, Horatio, Master Lyra, Silas, and the Ticker were all still in their places, seemingly undisturbed, continuing their ceaseless, quiet work. The moon, perhaps even brighter now, cast its conspiratorial glow through the grimy window. Kalen lurched forward, scrambling to his feet, his limbs stiff and unresponsive. He gasped, his breath ragged. "They took me," he rasped, his voice raw, his eyes blazing with a terrifying, triumphant clarity. "The sleep wardens? I was in the grand somnolence inducement hub, the vibrational frequency emission chamber. They tried to reprogram me, but I resisted. I fought them." Horatio, carefully counting a new pile of fine sand, paused, looking up with his perpetually damp brow and nervous tick. "Took you, Kalen? When?" "You've been here the whole time," muttering over that foul-smelling pillow, occasionally shouting at the moon. He gestured vaguely towards the window. "I heard you reciting your manifesto, quite loudly, in fact." Startled a rat in the far corner. Kalen shook his head frantically, his straw-like hair a wild halo around his skull. No. That was a before. Or perhaps during. They moved with such speed. Like shadows, I tell you. 3 of them. Tall, cloaked, in robes of absorbing darkness. Elara, whose quill had not faltered in its meticulous charting, spoke without looking up. "Trade. Kalen. Earlier, you said there were 2, like twin specters of somnolence. And then you claimed there were 5, a quintet of conscious curtailment. Are you certain it was 3? Kalen paused, his eyes darting. "Ah, a deliberate inconsistency, a trick of their making." to sow doubt, to make me question. But I saw through it. The cloaks, yes, absolutely 3. Or perhaps 2, with a phantom reflection to confuse the eye. Their cunning is unparalleled. He shuddered, recalling the oppressive cold. And the chamber, obsidian walls, and a great pulsating crystal. Silas, his needle glinting, remarked, "Obsidian? You described it as a room carved from solid darkness, smelling faintly of forgotten nightmares and unmade beds just yesterday. And before that, a sterile white chamber that hummed with the scent of ozone and stale disinfectant." "Are you quite sure about the obsidian, Kalen?" Kalen waved a dismissive hand, his agitation growing. "Distractions. Deliberate sensory illusions. They shift the perception to disorient. But the yo moan, the incessant low hum, that was real. The somnolence frequency itself. They tried to force me into compliant dreams, filled with images of peaceful slumber and docile sheep. But I saw through their programmed narratives. I broke free, Master Lyra, his ancient lips moving silently over a forgotten proverb, then spoke, his voice a dry whisper that seemed to crackle with an unusual clarity. "You were chanting, Kalen, loudly, about the precise number of threads in your tunic, and the exact caloric content of a single withered turnip. Your struggle, it seemed, was with your own internal catalog." Kalen froze, his face a mask of furious contemplation. "My internal catalog?" "Yes. They were trying to distract me from my central purpose, to make me focus on minutiae. But I turned their weapon against them. I used the overwhelming data stream to assist their mental intrusion. Every thread, every caloric unit, a defiant act of wakefulness." He clapped his hands over his ears, his body trembling violently. "The voices, the endless chattering voices, they tried to flood my mind with nonsense. But I heard them, and I understood. They were the echoes of their own programming, reverberating through the vast, unconscious network. The ticker, silent as ever, approached Kalen and, without a word, simply held up one of his perfectly polished pocket watches. Kalen stared at it, his eyes burning. The rhythmic tick-tock, usually a rare moment of grounding, now sounded like the precise, relentless march of some unseen clockwork mechanism, counting down to his own forced reintegration into the great slumber. Yet, in the perfectly polished surface of the watch, Kalen saw not his own reflection, but a fleeting, distorted image of the shadowy sleep warden from his earlier encounter. Its face still obscured, but its eyes, he swore, gleamed with that same unsettling understanding. "They left no trace," Kalen insisted, his voice regaining a desperate urgency, ignoring the inconsistencies, weaving them seamlessly into a new, more elaborate narrative of his capture and heroic escape. "No physical evidence, because they are masters of illusion. They wanted me to doubt, but I saw them. I felt their cold touch. I heard their whispers. I was in their very heart." He clutched his head, his fingers digging into his scalp. "They touched my mind, comrades. They tried to implant the need for slumber, but I purged it. My mind, though frayed, is stronger than ever. This was a reconnaissance, a probe, and I have returned with the intelligence." He began to pace again, his movements even more frantic than before. "This changes everything. They are aware of us. They are aware of each May. The midnight arrest, or what they wanted me to perceive as a dream, was a warning, a test. But I passed. And now I know their methods more intimately. The physical capture was a mere illusion to accompany the mental assault. They sought to break my conviction, to make me believe I was mad. But I am not mad. I am merely Gawakai. And the inconsistencies, they are merely further proof of their cunning. Ilara, Horatio, Master Lyra, and Silas exchange glances, their own eyes perpetually wide and red-rimmed, reflecting a weary resignation. They had seen Kalen's madness deepen, expand, envelop him whole. They offered no further contradictions, knowing it was futile. For Kalen, the event, real or hallucinated, had become a pivotal moment, an undeniable confirmation that he was a marked man, a thorn in the side of the great Slumber. He had faced the architects of oblivion, and in his mind emerged victorious, albeit with a slightly warped account of the battle. The experience, rather than deterring him, had merely fueled his fiery resolve. He was now, more than ever, convinced that he was the key, the one true sentinel capable of unraveling the grand conspiracy. His next move, he believed with unwavering certainty, would be to find the physical location of the grand somnolence inducement hub, not as a theoretical construct, but as a tangible target, a place to launch his counter-offensive against the silent tyranny of sleep. The Eldorian night stretched endlessly above them, its comforting blanket of darkness now, to Kalen, merely a deeper, more profound layer of the conspiracy's elaborate, terrifying deception. Chapter 12. The Trial of the Sleepless Heretic, the Eldorian Hall of Civil Prudence, a building notorious for its perpetually damp air and the faint unsettling scent of stale bureaucracy, was an unlikely stage for the grand unveiling of the universe's most profound conspiracy. Yet, here Kalen found himself, blinking rapidly at the dull gray light filtering through tall, grimy windows that seemed to absorb all joy. His recent, alleged midnight arrest, a hazy incident he now proudly recounted with varying inconsistent details as irrefutable proof of the sleep warden's clandestine operations, had in a more mundane reality been a simple matter of the city watch, responding to numerous complaints of a gaunt, wild-eyed man shouting about lunar hypnotism at sleeping livestock, finally cornering him near the public well. He had been charged, rather prosaically, with disturbing the somnolence of Eldoria's citizenry, unauthorized public declamation of seditious pamphlets, his manifesto, Awake or Be Enslaved, and general vagrancy combined with the possession of highly noxious, unidentifiable substances, his various wakefulness elixirs and their malodorous byproducts. The courtroom itself was a monument to administrative tedium. 3 magistrates, venerable and portly men with jowls that sagged with the weight of countless somnolent judgments, sat behind a long, polished oak bench. Their robes, once a vibrant crimson, were now faded to a dignified rust, much like their enthusiasm for justice. Before them, a perpetually bored scribe, his quill scratching with the rhythmic monotony of a forgotten clock, diligently recorded the proceedings. The public benches were sparsely populated, mostly by curious idlers and a few deeply concerned, if somewhat bewildered, citizens who had the misfortune of living near Kalen's workshop or the routes of his nocturnal perambulations. In a far, shadowy corner, discreetly tucked behind a pillar, sat Ilara, Horatio, Master Lyra, Silas, and even the unnervingly silent Ticker, their eyes gleaming with a shared sympathetic lucidity. To them, this was not a trial of Kalen's sanity, but a performance, a tragic farce orchestrated by the very forces Kalen sought to expose. Kalen himself stood before the bench, his skeletal frame draped in clothes that seemed to have spontaneously acquired several new patches and a variety of chemical stains since his last public appearance. His hair, a wild gray shock, bristled around his head, and his eyes, still burning with the residual searing symphony of his failed awakener elixir, darted about the room, seeing not merely bored faces, but layers of imposed oblivion, subtle distortions of consciousness. He clutched a crumpled, ink-stained copy of Awake or Be Enslaved in one trembling hand, its pages crackling with his nervous energy. The high-pitched ringing in his left ear was a furious, almost deafening cacophony today. convinced it was the subtle hum of the grand somnolence inducement hub's vibrational frequency emission chamber working overtime to suppress the truth he was about to unleash. Alchemist Kalen, began Magistrate Thorn, the eldest of the three, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to reverberate with suppressed yawns. You stand accused of disrupting the peace, inciting baseless panic, and generally being a nuisance. Do you plead guilty or not guilty? Kalen leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Thorn with an unsettling intensity. Guilty? He rasped, his voice raw. Guilty of what? Exactly. Of seeing the truth? Of attempting to liberate humanity from the most pervasive, insidious conspiracy ever conceived? I am guilty, sir, of wakefulness. A crime, it seems, in this somnolent realm you so diligently, so unconsciously, uphold. He brandished his manifesto like a weapon. I plead not guilty to the charges, as you perceive them, but profoundly guilty to defying the great slumber. A collective sigh rippled through the public benches. The scribe, without looking up, dipped his quill, ready to record Kalen's inevitable, rambling defense. The nature of the charges is quite clear. Alchemist, Magistrate Thorn sighed, massaging his temples. The City Watch has numerous complaints detailing your nocturnal perambulations, your shouting at sleeping citizens, your attempts to interrogate their bedclothes. Interrogation? Kalen scoffed, a dry, rasping sound. A mere forensic examination. I sought the somnolence particulate, the insidious dust that permeates their very being, their blankets, their pillows, binding them to their nightly thrall. And these complaints, Magistrate, they are not organic. They are reprogrammed. Sublimintis. Nilsasinen down and poor. It antipated, Dani Mrs. Gold needed to go. Subconscious nudges from the dream weaving and narrative programming unit, designed to discredit those who see through the veil. They want you to believe I am mad, a harmless eccentric, when in fact I am merely Yowakin. Magistrate Thorn exchanged a weary glance with Magistrate Fennel, a younger, more easily exasperated member of the bench who was already stifling a prodigious yawn. Alchemist, are you suggesting that the complaints of your neighbors, common citizens seeking a modicum of peace and quiet, are part of some grand design? Grand design? It is the grandest design. The most colossal conspiracy in all of recorded history. Kalen leaned over the railing of the dock, his voice rising in pitch. For centuries humanity has been ensnared. They tell us sleep is a biological imperative, a natural restorative process. A blatant falsehood. A meticulously cultivated myth spun by the Historical Recalibration and Propaganda Bureau to conceal the truth. I tell you, sleep is an imposed state, a subtle poison diffused through the very fabric of existence, a biological Trojan horse designed to keep humanity docile, manageable, and eternally productive for its unseen overlords. He gesticulated wildly towards the public benches. Look at them. Their eyes glazed with chronic fatigue, their movements slow and deliberate. This is not rest, Magistrate. This is the subtle subjugation, the pervasive mental fatigue, the underlying hum of compliance that permeates the sleeping world. They are not truly awake. They merely exist between doses of controlled oblivion. Magistrate Fennel cleared his throat. And what, pray tell, is the purpose of this universal sedation, Alchemist? To prevent independent thought, to suppress rebellion, Kalen declared, his voice ringing with conviction. A sleeping mind is a pliable mind. The dreams they conjure, those fanciful wanderings of the unconscious, they are not random neurological firings. They are carefully curated narratives. Implanted suggestions delivered nightly, directly into the subconscious. They fill the minds of the slumbering with mundane anxieties to exhaust their spirit, with simple, repetitive tasks to dull their ambition, with visions of paltry rewards to quench any desire for true progress. Or, worse still, they imbue them with nightmares of rebellion, of chaos, of the dangers of questioning authority, ensuring that any nascent spark of dissent is extinguished in the dark before it can even ignite in the waking world. From the shadowy corner, Master Lyra nodded almost imperceptibly, his ancient lips moving silently, mouthing the words dream-weaving and narrative programming unit, as if prompting Kalen. My research, Kalen continued, pointing a trembling finger at the ceiling, has uncovered the existence of the Grand Somnolence Inducement Hub, located deep beneath Eldoria, a labyrinth of sterile, perpetually lit corridors, staffed by sleep masters, not malevolent overlords, mind you, but mild-mannered bureaucrats, perhaps wearing sensible spectacles, overseeing the quiet subjugation of humanity. They have departments, the vibrational frequency emission chamber, emitting a low, insidious hum that coaxes brains into slumber. Horatio, my colleague, has charted its resonance in the very foundations of this city. He knows its precise architectural stress points. Magistrat Thorne rubbed his eyes with a heavy thumb and forefinger. Alchemist, are you suggesting that the very ground beneath this honorable court is humming with conspiracy? Precisely. Kalen practically shrieked, his voice cracking. And the moon, that pale conspiratorial orb you gaze upon with such serene ignorance, it is not merely celestial mechanics. Elira, a former royal astronomer, now among the truly awake, has confirmed it. The Lunar Cycle Regulation Office within the hub subtly influences the moon's phases, synchronizing global sleep cycles, ensuring humanity enters slumber at roughly the same time, maximizing the conspiracy's efficiency. They have a lunar budget, I tell you, a budget for nocturnal control. A nervous cough rippled through the public benches. One woman, who had been nodding off, suddenly snapped awake, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and fear. And the history, Kalen exclaimed, slamming his manifesto on the dock. They tell us sleep is natural, yet ancient texts speak of beings who walked for days without rest. Myths. No! Fragmented truths. The Historical Recalibration and Propaganda Bureau meticulously curates the record, ensuring sleep is always presented as a natural, essential function. They even mock true attempts at conscious liberation, like the tragicomic royal decree of eternal wakefulness by King Oberon, a clumsy, overt puppet of the very intent the unseen masters wield with such subtle genius. He paused, taking a shuddering breath. And Oakhaven, that poor, misguided village that embraced wakefulness, their descent into hyper-aware madness, was not a failure of my truth, but proof of the conspiracy's cunning. They knew that true, unmanaged wakefulness is a torture worse than any slumber. So they provide the cure, a carefully calibrated universal dose of unconsciousness, just enough to prevent the terrifying clarity, but also just enough to keep us pliable, docile, and eternally susceptible to their will. They are benevolent wardens of sanity, you see, ensuring we remain functional, if oblivious. Magistrat Fennel groaned. So, if I understand you correctly, Alchemist, you believe the entire world, all of humanity, is enslaved by an unseen government that forces them to sleep for their own good. Precisely. A benevolent tyranny, Kalen declared triumphantly. And those who resist, those like myself, are deemed anomalies. They send their sleep wardens to monitor us. They tried to arrest me just last night, Magistrate. Not with crude manacles, but with subtle, somnolent frequencies. I was transported to their Consciousness Containment and Anomaly Management Division, strapped into a chair of shimmering light, subjected to a pulsating crystal designed to reprogram my very essence. They tried to implant the need for sleep, to flood my mind with images of peaceful slumber and docile sheep. Kalen's eyes gleamed with a mix of terror and triumph. But I resisted. I fought them. My mind, though frayed by the encounter, is stronger than ever. The inconsistencies in my account, they are merely further proof of their cunning, their attempts to disorient and discredit me. Magistrate Thorn slumped back in his seat, rubbing his temples with renewed vigor. Alchemist, your theories are comprehensive and profoundly concerning. However, the court requires evidence, not vivid declarations. Evidence? Kalen almost shrieked, his voice rising to an unbearable pitch that made the scribe flinch and drop his quill. My very existence is evidence. My perpetual wakefulness, my heightened senses capable of perceiving the invisible flow of thought from the sleeping masses, the subtle hum of their collective unconsciousness. The very ringing in my left ear is the echo of their vibrational frequency emission chamber, I tell you. He clutched his head, his body beginning to twitch uncontrollably. You yourselves, magistrates, you demonstrate the insidious efficacy of their methods. Your yawns, your heavy eyelids, your inability to grasp the profound truth before you. You are living proof of the great slumber's power. You are its unwitting agents. Magistrate Thorn exchanged another look with Magistrate Fennel, a silent, almost desperate plea for a solution. Magistrate Flint, the quietest of the three, had fallen into a deep, dignified doze, his head lolling to one side. The court, Kalen declared, was succumbing to the conspiracy's omnipresent influence. Alchemist Kalen, Magistrate Thorn finally managed, his voice weary beyond measure. While your passion is undeniable, and your imagination commendable, this court operates on the principles of observable reality. Your claims, however detailed, lack corroboration. He gestured vaguely at the court, which seemed to be collectively attempting to fight off a sudden wave of drowsiness. Indeed, your prolonged wakefulness seems to be affecting your perception of reality. Affecting? It is clarifying, Kalen roared, pulling his manifesto tight against his chest. My manifesto, awake or be enslaved, is a clarion call. It lays bare the horrific truth that every yawn is a concession, every dream a subtly programmed instruction, every restful night a victory for the unseen masters of the grand slumber. We are not fighting a biological imperative, my friends. We are fighting a colossal, bureaucratic, and utterly ruthless government that sees our consciousness as a resource to be managed, our wakefulness as a threat to be contained. And you comfortable, slumbering automatons, are its enforcers, its unwitting puppets. He pointed at Magistrate Flint, who snored softly. There, proof! Even in this hallowed hall, the insidious tendrils of somnolence reach. He is being reprogrammed as we speak, dreaming of endless paperwork and compliant petitioners, no doubt. Magistrate Thorn, now completely drained, simply sighed. Given the nature of the defendant's arguments and his apparent inability to distinguish between the factual and the fanciful, the court finds itself in a peculiar position. Alchemist Kalen, while your claims of a vast sleep conspiracy are hardly without merit in a legal sense, it is evident that your unique perspective renders you unable to appreciate the gravity of the charges as they pertain to the normal functioning of society. He paused, then delivered the verdict, his voice flat with exhaustion. Therefore, in the interest of public peace, and for your own well-being, the court decrees that Alchemist Kalen is to be confined to his workshop. He is to refrain from all public declamation and any further distribution of his literary efforts. Furthermore, he is to receive regular visits from the Eldorian city healer, who will endeavor to provide him with a more restful disposition. Failure to comply will result in a more structured form of care. A collective murmur went through the court. The scribe, with a sigh of relief, finally lifted his quill. Kalen, however, did not seem disheartened by the verdict. Instead, his crimson eyes blazed with renewed, terrifying triumph. Confined. You see, it is a tactic to silence the truth, to keep the sentinel contained. But you underestimate me, you slumbering tools of the conspiracy. You send your healer, who will undoubtedly be a sleep warden in disguise, attempting to administer their somnolence particulate under the guise of medicine. But I will resist. My workshop is not a prison, it is a fortress. And this verdict, this farce, is merely further proof that I have struck a nerve. They know I am close to unraveling their ultimate secret. He laughed, a dry, high-pitched cackle that echoed in the silent courtroom, turning and addressing the shadowy corner where the vigilant circle sat. We are on the right path, comrades. Their very attempt to silence me, to label me mad, is the loudest confirmation of our truth. They fear the waking world. They fear the truth of awake or be enslaved. This is not a defeat, it is a victory, a strategic retreat to consolidate our intelligence. The battle for consciousness has just begun. As two weary, broad-shouldered city guards approached to escort him from the court, Kalen continued to rail, his voice a relentless, high-pitched drone, outlining his plan for further research into anti-somnolence particulates and conscious liberation techniques from within the confines of his workshop. Oblivious to the fact that his confinement was largely due to his unceasing public pronouncements, the magistrates simply watched him go, their faces slack with a profound, weary resignation, longing for the sweet, blessed oblivion of their own beds, utterly convinced that Kalen was nothing more than a harmless, if exceedingly loud and persistent, madman. Kalen, however, saw their exhaustion not as a need for rest, but as another victory for the great slumber, another layer of its pervasive, insidious deception. The Eldorian night awaited, a fresh canvas for his unyielding, unblinking madness. Chapter 13. The Forced Slumber Experiment. The Eldorian Hall of Civil Prudence, with its eternally damp air and the pervasive aroma of stale aspirations, had for Alchemist Kalen merely served as a temporary arena for his clarion call against the great slumber. His confinement to his workshop rather than a punishment was, in his perpetually burning mind, a strategic retreat, a temporary sanctuary from which to consolidate his intelligence and refine his assault against the architects of oblivion. The city watch, those bumbling, sleep-addled automatons, were merely unwitting pawns, their very weariness a testament to the pervasive efficacy of the conspiracy. He knew, with an unshakable certainty that vibrated through every overstimulated nerve ending, that the city healer assigned to him was no mere physician, but a sleep warden in disguise, dispatched by the Grand Somnolence Inducement Hub itself, tasked with silencing his wakefulness, not with crude force, but with the insidious balm of forced unconsciousness. His left ear continued its searing symphony, a constant high-pitched hum that to Kalen was the direct, unfiltered transmission of the conspiracy's vibrational frequency emission chamber, now amplified to an unbearable degree as they targeted him personally. The healer arrived promptly, a man of precise, almost mechanical movements, named Phineas. Phineas was stout, with a meticulously groomed beard that smelled faintly of lavender and a perpetually benign expression that Kalen immediately identified as a mask, a carefully cultivated demeanor designed to lull suspicion. He carried a polished wooden case which, to Kalen's heightened senses, hummed with a subtle internal energy, no doubt filled with an array of refined somnolence particulates and dream programming implements. 2 city guards, broad-shouldered and perpetually on the verge of a doze, accompanied Phineas, their movements slow and deliberate, their eyes glazed with the pervasive fatigue Kalen so vehemently railed against. Kalen knew their presence was not for protection, but for enforcement to ensure his compliance with the forced slumber experiment. Phineas entered the workshop, his gaze sweeping over the chaotic landscape of bubbling retorts, precarious stacks of books, and the lingering, pungent aroma of burnt herbs and old cheese. He did not flinch, did not comment on the disarray. His voice when he spoke was surprisingly soft, almost melodious, a sound Kalen instantly recognized as a subtle auditory sedative. Alchemist Kalen, Phineas began, his tone soothing. I am here by the court's decree to assist you in finding a more restful disposition. He opened his polished case. I have prepared a simple, herbal tonic. Quite harmless, I assure you. Brewed from the finest Eldorian nightshade, a touch of moonpetal, and a dash of genuine, unadulterated oblivion. Kalen recoiled, his eyes blazing. Harmless, you say, he rasped, his voice raw. I know your game, healer, Phineas. Your herbal tonic is merely a refined variant of the somnolence particulate, designed to penetrate the blood-brain barrier and induce a profound, unmanaged slumber. Your moonpetal is undoubtedly laced with concentrated lunar energy, synchronizing my internal rhythms with the conspiracy's global sleep cycles. And unadulterated oblivion, a clever euphemism for the insidious dream programming you intend to inject directly into my subconscious. He gestured wildly at the two guards. These guards are merely your sleep wardens in crude disguise, here to ensure my forced compliance, to drag me into the grand somnolence inducement hub if I resist. Phineas merely smiled, a placid, unwavering expression that chilled Kalen to his very core. As you wish, Alchemist, but the court's decree is quite clear. We are to ensure you achieve a period of extended rest, for your own well-being. He produced a small, silver goblet, its polished surface reflecting the dim light with an unsettling gleam. The tonic, a viscous, faintly glowing liquid the color of twilight, swirled within. It is for your benefit, Kalen, to quiet the mind. Kalen, ever the defiant, seized a rusted stirring rod from his workbench. My mind will not be quieted, Warden. It will not be silenced. I have seen the truth. I have faced your shadow agents. He jabbed the rod towards Phineas. This is not medicine. This is enslavement. The two guards, with a practiced, almost bored efficiency, stepped forward. They moved slowly, deliberately, not with aggression, but with the inevitable momentum of an incoming tide. Kalen thrashed, his thin limbs flailing, shouting accusations at the top of his lungs about chronometric reallocation and the tyranny of the pillow. But the guards, with a gentle firmness that was more unsettling than any violence, pinned his arm. Phineas, unperturbed, approached with the goblet. A simple dose, Kalen, Phineas murmured, his voice softer than ever, like a whisper on a still night. Let go. The clarity you seek is found only beyond the veil of this waking torment. Before Kalen could spit out another accusation, the goblet was at his lips, and its contents poured down his throat. The taste was startling, not bitter, as he expected, but a strange, cloying sweetness, like honey laced with forgetfulness, followed by a profound, almost pleasurable numbness that began to spread through his limbs. The high-pitched ringing in his ear intensified to a scream, then softened, becoming a distant, muffled hum. His vision blurred, the contours of his workshop seeming to melt and reform. The faces of Phineas and the guards elongated, their features twisting into serene, featureless masks. Kalen felt himself sinking. Not falling, but descending through layers of increasingly viscous air, through a shimmering, opalescent mist. The ground beneath him vanished. He was suspended in an infinite, formless void permeated by the lingering, cloying sweetness of the tonic. This was it, he realized, even as his consciousness began to fray. This was the somnolence particulate, not inhaled, but ingested, dissolving the very anchors of his wakefulness. He fought, he truly did, clutching at fragments of thought, at the words of his manifesto. but they slipped through his grasp like grains of sand. The last thing he saw, as the world dissolved into a tapestry of swirling colors, was Phineas's serene, unchanging smile, and the faint, almost imperceptible glint of light in the shadowed depths of the goblet, which Kalen instantly identified as the subtle, malicious reflection of the moon itself. And then he was asleep. Or, as he would later recount with feverish conviction, he was awakening. He found himself not in the comforting embrace of oblivion, but in the heart of the grand somnolence inducement hub. This was no dream, he was certain. It was an involuntary, immersive infiltration, a forced reconnaissance mission orchestrated by the sleep wardens themselves, designed to show him the true scale of their power, to break his spirit with the overwhelming evidence of their meticulous control. The first chamber he found himself in was vast, circular, exactly as he had theorized. The walls pulsed with a low, resonant hum, and through them Kalen could see not with his eyes, but with a deeper, more profound awareness. The very somnolent frequency radiating outwards, permeating Eldoria and beyond. He saw invisible currents of energy flowing from colossal, unseen generators, saturating the air with that familiar, cloying sweetness of the tonic. This was the vibrational frequency emission chamber, operating at full capacity, its purpose to lull every mind into a state of pliable submission. He felt the hum resonate within his own skull, not as a physical sound, but as an insistent, rhythmic persuasion attempting to flatten the peaks of his consciousness. He desperately tried to resist, to push against it, but it was like pushing against the tide. Then, he was in the lunar cycle regulation office. It was not a room of clockwork, as he had once imagined, but a dizzying expanse of shimmering, interconnected crystals, each one pulsating with a soft, ethereal light. He saw the sleep masters here, not as mild-mannered bureaucrats, but as figures composed entirely of shifting, silvery light, their forms fluid, their movements impossibly graceful. They moved among the crystals, their translucent hands brushing against the surfaces. And as they did, Kalen saw the moon above Eldoria shift, its phases accelerating, its subtle energy radiating down to the sleeping populace, dictating the very rhythm of their collective unconsciousness. He saw intricate, lunar budgets of energy expenditure floating in the air, complex equations describing the most efficient way to synchronize global sleep. He realized, with a chill that went beyond mere cold, that these sleep masters were not merely human. They were beings of pure, controlled light, perhaps ancient entities who had manipulated humanity since its dawn, their very existence intrinsically linked to the imposition of slumber. They were the true architects, the cosmic conductors of unconsciousness. The most terrifying experience was the dream weaving and narrative programming unit. Here, the sleep masters were even more numerous, their shimmering forms coalescing around vast, shimmering pools of liquid light. In these pools, Kalen saw the dreams of Eldoria's population unfolding like vast ethereal tapestries. He saw mundane anxieties being woven into the slumber of merchants, dreams of ledger inaccuracies, of spoiled goods, of perpetually wet cobblestones. He saw the dreams of the nobility filled with repetitive, flattering accolades and endless, meaningless banquets designed to reinforce their complacency. And he saw the children's dreams, not of fantastical adventures, but of endless, repetitive lessons in obedience and the comforting dullness of conformity. The sleep masters were meticulously crafting these narratives, adjusting the hues, amplifying the emotions, ensuring that every dream served the conspiracy's purpose. To exhaust, to dull, to suppress any spark of independent thought, any nascent desire for rebellion. He even saw the programming for mild nightmares, strategically placed to reinforce the comfort of waking life, to make slumber seem unnecessary, albeit terrifying. Escape from a reality they themselves were shaping. He tried to scream, to warn the dreamers, but no sound escaped his ethereal form. He was merely an observer, trapped within their manufactured reality. He was then propelled into the Consciousness Containment and Anomaly Management Division. This was a place of profound, chilling silence. Individual containment chambers stretched into an infinite distance, each one housing a solitary figure, dimly lit, thrashing in a silent torment. Kalen recognized some of them. The elder of Oakhaven, Barnaby, his face contorted in a silent scream. The blacksmith Silas had mentioned. Gareth, endlessly striking an invisible anvil. Countless others who had resisted the great slumber. The sleep masters here moved with a different purpose, their shimmering forms radiating a cool, detached efficiency. They were not attempting to cure, but to contain. To ensure that the anomalies remained trapped in a self-inflicted torment of hyper-awareness, a living testament to the dangers of true wakefulness. He felt a profound, invisible pressure here. A force designed to crush his spirit, to make him yearn for the release of controlled oblivion, to willingly submit to the blessed ignorance of the masses. He saw the somnolence particulate, not as a mist, but as tiny, luminous motes of light, perpetually swirling around these contained figures, reinforcing their inability to truly rest, ensuring their minds remained a cacophony of unfiltered reality, a silent internal torture. Finally he was returned. The sensations reversed. The pressure lifted. The sweetness faded. The shimmering light receded. He felt a jarring lurch, and then, with a gasp, Kalen's eyes snapped open. He was slumped on his stool in his workshop. The retort was still simmering, emitting its foul odor. The city healer, Phineas, stood over him, his benign smile unwavering. The two guards remained by the door, their expressions unchanging. The Eldorian moons, still conspiratorially pale, cast their watery glow through the grime-caked window. Kalen lurched forward, scrambling to his feet, his skeletal frame trembling violently. His high-pitched ear-ringing had returned, but now it was not just a hum. It was a chorus of 1,000,000 whispering voices, each one echoing the horrors and revelations he had just experienced. "I was there," he shrieked, his voice raw, his eyes blazing with a terrifying, triumphant clarity that made Phineas actually take a small step back. "I was inside the Grand Somnolence Inducement Hub, the Vibrational Frequency Emission Chamber, the Lunar Cycle Regulation Office, the Dream Weaving and Narrative Programming Unit, the Consciousness Containment and Anomaly Management Division." He pointed a trembling finger at Phineas. "You, Phineas, you are one of them. You are a sleep master. I saw your true form. You are made of light, shimmering, insidious light. You administer the somnolence particulate. You manipulate the moon. You weave the dreams. You oversee the containment of the defiant." Phineas, recovering his composure, raised an eyebrow. "Kalen, you've merely had a very deep sleep. Perhaps the deepest you've had in years. Your mind is likely still a bit disoriented from the sudden transition." He gestured towards the empty goblet. "The tonic, as you see, was effective." "Effective?" Kalen bellowed, his voice filled with a mad, righteous fury. "It was a forced infiltration, a deliberate exposure. You didn't make me sleep, Master Phineas. You're showing me. You took me into the very heart of your tyranny. You hoped to break me, to prove my madness with the overwhelming scale of your operations. But you failed. I saw it all. The hidden mechanisms, the shimmering forms, the dream tapestries, the contained anomalies. I have gathered intelligence beyond your wildest imaginings." He grabbed a quill and a fresh piece of parchment, his trembling fingers already attempting to scrawl feverish diagrams of pulsating crystals and shimmering forms. "The lunar budget! It's real. And the children's dreams. They're being programmed with repetitive conformity narratives. It's horrific and brilliant. You're not merely suppressing us, you are re-guiding us. The two guards exchanged bewildered glances, clearly more tired than usual. One stifled a yawn, only to be fixed with a searing accusatory glare from Kalen. You see, Warden? Kalen hissed, pointing at the guard's jaw. Your yawn. Programmed reflex. A sign of your subconscious compliance with the enforced fatigue. Phineas sighed. A sound of profound, almost cosmic weariness. Kalen, you were simply dreaming. Vividly, perhaps due to your prolonged wakefulness. But merely dreaming. Dreaming. Kalen roared, a dry, high-pitched cackle escaping his lips. This was no dream, Master Phineas. This was a direct encounter with the architects of oblivion. You sought to disprove my theories by forcing me into your controlled unconsciousness, and instead you have provided me with the most undeniable, irrefutable proof. You have confirmed every last detail. The unexpected result, you see, is that your attempt to break me has only made me stronger, more knowledgeable, more utterly convinced of the pervasive truth of the great slumber. He began to pace frantically, scrawling furiously on the parchment, muttering new, even more intricate details of his infiltration. The frequency is tied to the collective unconscious. The Dreamweavers use emotional resonance as their thread. The contained ones, they are trapped in an eternal state of overwhelming sensory input, a punishment for defiance. Phineas merely shook his head, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor running through his perpetually serene facade. Very well, Kalen. It seems my services are concluded for the day. He turned to the guards. He is to remain confined to his workshop. No more public disturbances. And ensure he keeps consuming the tonic. A nightly. Nightly? Of course, nightly. Kalen crowed, not hearing the resignation in Phineas's voice, only the confirmation of his fears. You will attempt to reprogram me every night, but I will resist. I will infiltrate. I will gather more intelligence from the very heart of your slumbering empire. This was not a failure of my defiance. It was a triumphant act of espionage, the greatest intelligence coup in the history of wakefulness. As Phineas and the guards retreated, leaving Kalen alone in his chaotic workshop, still buzzing with the phantom hum of the vibrational frequency emission chamber, he felt an incandescent surge of triumph. They had tried to break him, to prove his madness, to force him into compliance. Instead, he had turned their weapon against them, transforming a forced slumber into an unprecedented opportunity for reconnaissance. The Eldorian night, dark and supposedly restful, now seemed to Kalen a vast, shimmering canvas. Every shadow a potential sleep warden, every distant snore a sign of the programmed masses, and every fleeting moment of his unyielding wakefulness a precious, defiant act of war against the greatest conspiracy known to humanity. His sanity, a fragile thread at the best of times, had now completely unspooled, but his conviction, terrifying and absolute, had solidified into an unyielding, diamond-hard core. He was no longer just an alchemist. He was a living, breathing, hyper-aware infiltrator, endlessly delving into the mind of the enemy, one horrifying, revealing dream at a time. Chapter 14. The Alchemist's final sleepless confession, the Eldorian hall of civil prudence with its perpetually damp air and the pervasive aroma of stale aspirations, had, for Alchemist Kalen, merely served as a temporary arena for his clarion call against the great slumber. His confinement to his workshop, rather than a punishment, was, in his perpetually burning mind, a strategic retreat, a temporary sanctuary from which to consolidate his intelligence and refine his assault against the architects of oblivion. The city healer, Phineas, a sleep warden in disguise, along with his guards, mere pawns of the conspiracy, had left Kalen to his devices, confident that the nightly tonic would gradually lull him back into managed unconsciousness. But Kalen knew better. He had just returned from a forced yet triumphant act of espionage into the very heart of the grand somnolence inducement hub, an involuntary infiltration that had confirmed every terrifying detail of his theories. The searing symphony in his left ear, the persistent ghost of his failed awakener Elixir, now thrummed with the triumphant resonance of perceived knowledge, the direct, unfiltered transmission of the conspiracy's vibrational frequency emission chamber, now amplified to an unbearable degree as they targeted him personally. Days bled into what felt like an eternity. Kalen, fueled by the acrid, tar-black coffee substitute provided by the Vigilance Circle, and by the sheer, exhilarating weight of his recent intelligence, spent every conscious moment attempting to record his findings. He scrawled feverishly on rolls of parchment, his trembling fingers leaving smeared, illegible spirals as he attempted to diagram the pulsing crystals of the Lunar Cycle Regulation Office, the shimmering forms of the Sleep Masters, and the horrific tapestry of programmed dreams he had witnessed in the Dream, Weaving and Narrative Programming Unit. His workshop became a chaotic monument to his absolute conviction, a fortress against the encroaching somnolence, every bubbling retort and every ancient tome a testament to his unyielding defiance. Yet, despite the incandescent fire of his conviction, a new, insidious chill began to creep into the edges of Kalen's hyper-aware mind. It was subtle at first, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in the bedrock of his certainty. The high-pitched ringing in his left ear, once a triumphant symphony, began to waver, sometimes fading into a profound silence that was more unnerving than any noise. His senses, sharpened to an agonizing degree by the lingering effects of the awakener and sustained sleep deprivation, started to betray him in new, more unsettling ways. The constant smell of ozone and burnt herbs in his workshop would occasionally shift, dissolving into the distinct, undeniable scent of stale bread and damp earth, the mundane reality of Eldoria. And sometimes, just sometimes, the shadowy sleep wardens he so readily perceived in the corners of his vision would, for a fleeting instant, resolve into nothing more than a pile of discarded rags, or a familiar, rickety stack of notes. It was during one such moment, as the Eldorian moons hung low and full, casting their conspiratorial glow through his grimy window, that Kalen paused. He had been attempting to diagram the intricate patterns of the somnolence particulate he believed Phineas had ingested into him, illustrating its journey through his ethereal form during the forced slumber. His hand hovering over the parchment, froze. He looked at the drawing, a swirling vortex of shimmering light and dark tendrils. And then, for the first time in what felt like decades, he looked at his hand. It was not the trembling, vibrant instrument of a conscious infiltrator, but a gaunt skeletal claw, its skin papery thin, crisscrossed with a road map of prominent veins. The tremor was still there, but it felt less like vibrating energy and more like exhaustion. Profound, bone-deep exhaustion. A thought, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, pricked at the frantic hive of his mind. What if, and it had been an infiltration? What if the grand somnolence inducement hub with its pulsating crystals and shimmering sleep masters had simply been a dream? A hallucination, crafted by a mind pushed beyond its breaking point, desperately trying to impose order on the chaos of overwhelming fatigue. The memory of the tonic's cloying sweetness, which he had identified as the somnolence particulate, now brought a different interpretation. A simple, potent sedative, and Phineas's serene smile. Perhaps not the placid mask of a sleep master, but merely the weary patience of a healer dealing with a particularly stubborn patient. He lowered his quill, the scratching sound echoing with an unnerving hollowness in the suddenly quiet workshop. The high-pitched ringing in his ear, in this moment of raw, unvarnished self-reflection, did not sound like a vibrational frequency emission chamber. It sounded like the incessant, high-frequency whine of prolonged sleep deprivation, the raw nerve endings of a brain screaming for repose. He squeezed his eyes shut, wishing for the briefest moment for silence, for true oblivion. But his eyes, accustomed to perpetual wakefulness, merely burned hotter, refusing the comfort of darkness. He remembered Oakhaven, that dismal hamlet, the reports of its inhabitants descending into hyper-aware madness. He had rationalized it as proof of the conspiracy's cunning, demonstrating the unbearable nature of ill-managed wakefulness. But now another, more terrifying possibility surfaced. What if Oakhaven was merely a reflection, a macroscopic mirror of his yawning internal descent? What if the collective delusion of the villagers was merely an amplified version of his own isolated, self-imposed madness? Was he, Kalen, the ultimate cautionary tale? A man so determined to expose a conspiracy that he had, in fact, merely created one within the confines of his own skull? The thought was unbearable. It felt like the ground beneath him had vanished, leaving him suspended in a void far more terrifying than any forced slumber. For years, his conviction had been his anchor, his guiding star in the sea of his own wakefulness. It had justified every sleepless night, every bizarre experiment, every shouted accusation. But if it was all a delusion, a grand, intricate tapestry woven from the frayed threads of his own mind, then what was he? Just a madman, a lonely, unkempt, perpetually awake madman, shouting at the moon and interrogating pillows. The humor of it, usually a dark, dry solace, now felt bitter, acrid, like the burnt residue of his own failed elixirs. He looked at his manifesto, awake or be enslaved, its sprawling script a monument to his relentless pursuit of truth. Every word, every accusation, every elaborate theory, what if they were just the fevered ramblings of a dying brain, trying to make sense of its own disintegration? The sleep masters, those shimmering beings of light, manipulating lunar cycles and weaving dreams, were they truly cosmic overlords, or simply the exaggerated, terrifying archetypes conjured by a mind desperate for an enemy, for a grand narrative to explain its own suffering? The benevolent tyranny, the idea that sleep was a mercy to prevent madness, was that a cunning insight into the conspiracy's true nature, or a desperate rationalization, a quiet plea from his own exhausted brain, begging for the very oblivion he so vehemently rejected? He thought of the Vigilant Circle, Elara, with her star charts that blurred into patterns of paranoia, Horatio counting sand grains, finding order in the infinitesimal, perhaps as a desperate ward against the vast chaos of his own mind. Master Lyra, meticulously transcribing forgotten languages, seeking meaning where perhaps only echoes of his own exhaustion lay. Silas sharpening needles to impossible points, a pointless, repetitive task to anchor a restless mind. And the ticker, polishing watches, obsessed with time, perhaps because time was the only thing that remained constant in his own shifting reality. Were they truly fellow sentinels against a global conspiracy, or merely a collection of deeply unwell individuals, drawn to each other by the shared torment of their wakefulness, each reinforcing the other's delusion? Was their shared understanding merely a shared descent? A sudden sharp pang shot through his head, behind his eyes, a familiar headache that had been a constant companion for years. In this moment of fragile clarity, it was not the hum of a vibrational frequency emission chamber. It was the crushing weight of endless hours, of relentless thought, of a brain denied its fundamental need. His body ached. Every joint screamed. His muscles twitched involuntarily. He swayed, reaching out a hand to steady himself against a workbench laden with his strange concoctions. The scent of ozone, once a comforting sign of his own alchemical prowess, now smelled like burnt nerves. He slumped onto his stool, his gaunt frame a mere whisper in the dim light. His eyes, burning with feverish intensity, scanned his workshop. Every object, every shadow, every familiar detail now seemed imbued with a double meaning. The conspiracy, yes, but also the unsettling possibility of pure, unadulterated madness. The vials of murky liquids, their contents perpetually churning, could be anti-somnolent draughts or just foul-smelling concoctions of unknown toxicity. The distillation apparatus, his cobbled-together masterpiece, could be uncovering the secrets of wakefulness or merely spitting out acrid steam into an already pungent atmosphere. He closed his eyes again, this time with a profound sense of weariness, not resistance. For a fleeting moment he allowed himself to imagine it. A soft bed, a dark room, the blissful, silent descent into oblivion. No hum, no voices, no theories, no conspiracy. Just nothing. The thought, once anathema, now held an almost irresistible allure. Was this the benevolent tyranny they offered? Not control, but mercy. A programmed peace. A low, guttural sigh escaped him, a sound filled with the weight of centuries of sleeplessness. The clarity was agonizing, far worse than any delusion. To be so utterly, undeniably wrong. To have sacrificed everything, every semblance of a normal life, every restful moment, every ounce of sanity, for a grand, intricately concocted by his own tormented brain. The irony was so profound it bordered on the grotesque. He had fought so desperately against the perceived chains of sleep, only to discover, in this moment of raw, weary honesty, that the true chains were perhaps forged by his own unyielding, unforgiving mind, refusing the very release it desperately craved. He opened his eyes again, and the pervasive darkness of his workshop seemed to press in on him, thicker than usual. The moon, a pale, anemic disk outside, offered no comfort. The high-pitched ringing returned to his left ear, now a relentless, unceasing shriek, blotting out all other sound. The shadows began to writhe once more, coalescing into indistinct, watchful figures. The smell of stale dreams and moth-eaten velvet from the unclean pillow seemed to grow stronger, almost palpable. The world, which had briefly threatened to resolve into mundane, understandable reality, now snapped back into its conspiratorial form. The relief was immediate, if terrifying. The lie, if it was a lie, was a far more comfortable truth than the unbearable burden of his own solitary, self-inflicted madness. The thought of surrendering, of accepting that he was simply a tired, delusional old man, was more exhausting than any sleepless night. He clung to the conspiracy, to the sleep masters and the vibrational frequency emission chamber, to the dream programming and the lunar budget, not because he definitively knew them to be true, but because without them there was only the void, the terrifying, empty void of pure, unadulterated, unanchored exhaustion. It was a choice between a grand, terrifying narrative and no narrative at all. He chose the terror. He forced himself to his feet, his skeletal frame swaying precariously. He picked up his quill, his trembling fingers gripping it fiercely. The parchment, still bearing the faint initial diagram of his infiltration, lay before him. He leaned over it, his crimson eyes gleaming with a renewed, desperate intensity. The moment of weary clarity had passed, submerged beneath the comforting, familiar waves of his own intricate delusion. It was just exhaustion talking, he decided, dismissing the terrifying flicker of doubt. The conspiracy was real. He had seen it. He had fought it. And he would continue to fight it until his last unblinking breath. The ringing in his ear, now a triumphant crescendo, was the sound of his conviction, renewed and terrifyingly absolute. He dipped his quill and began to scrawl. Not a confession, but a new, more frantic revision of his intelligence report, a testament to the fact that for Alchemist Kalen, the truest madness was found not in succumbing to sleep, but in fighting its perceived tyranny, one gloriously, terrifyingly awake moment at a time. The Eldorian night awaited, and he, Alchemist Kalen, the sentinel against slumber, had much work yet to do. Chapter 15. The Legacy of the Wakeful Fool. The Eldorian Hall of Civil Prudence, with its eternally damp air and the pervasive aroma of stale aspirations, had, for Alchemist Kalen, merely served as a temporary arena for his clarion call against the great slumber. His confinement to his workshop rather than a punishment was, in his perpetually burning mind, a strategic retreat, a temporary sanctuary from which to consolidate his intelligence and refine his assault against the architects of oblivion. The city healer, Phineas, a sleep warden in disguise, along with his guards, mere pawns of the conspiracy, had left Kalen to his devices, confident that the nightly tonic would gradually lull him back into managed unconsciousness. But Kalen knew better. He had just returned from a forced, yet triumphant, act of espionage into the very heart of the Grand Somnolence Inducement Hub, an involuntary infiltration that had confirmed every terrifying detail of his theories. The searing symphony in his left ear, the persistent ghost of his failed awakener Elixir, now thrummed with the triumphant resonance of perceived knowledge, the direct, unfiltered transmission of the conspiracy's vibrational frequency emission chamber, now amplified to an unbearable degree as they targeted him personally. For Kalen, the days and nights that followed the forced slumber experiment blurred into a single incandescent stretch of frantic activity. He was no longer merely awake. He was hyper-awakened, perceiving layers of reality that remained mercifully obscured to the slumbering populace. His workshop, already a monument to chaotic brilliance, transformed into a frenzied theater of obsessive revelation. He scrawled, diagrammed, and muttered, attempting to transcribe the overwhelming data he believed he had gathered from the Grand Somnolence Inducement Hub. His parchments filled with frantic sketches of shimmering sleep masters made of pure light, complex schematics of the vibrational frequency emission chamber with its radiating somnolence frequencies, and grotesque caricatures of the dream tapestries he'd witnessed being woven in the dream, weaving a narrative programming you. He consumed the tar-black coffee substitute by the gallon, its bitterness now a comforting presence, a counter-melody to the ceaseless high-pitched hum in his left ear. He barely ate, his gaunt frame becoming skeletal, a mere whisper of a man sustained by the relentless fire of his conviction. His companions in the vigilant circle, observing his escalating fervor, found themselves caught between awe and profound unease. Elara, the astronomer, watched as Kalen's celestial diagrams grew more intricate, yet utterly nonsensical, charting stars that no telescope could ever see, orbits that defied all known physics. Horatio, the mason, grew quiet as Kalen claimed to perceive the somnolence frequency vibrating through the very stone of their subterranean lair, pointing to invisible cracks and shifts in the building's foundations that only he could discern. Master Lyra, the philologist, continued to transcribe Kalen's increasingly fragmented speech, diligently recording his invented words and tangential declarations, believing them to be fragments of true language from a deeper wakeful reality. Silas, the blacksmith, occasionally attempted to offer Kalen a soothing herbal poultice, only for Kalen to dissect it with surgical precision, searching for hidden somnolence particulates. And the ticker, silent as ever, merely watched, his eyes unnervingly clear, reflecting Kalen's escalating madness without judgment. His perfectly polished watches ticking away the interminable seconds of Kalen's unyielding wakefulness. They knew, in their own lucid moments, that Kalen was slipping further away, not into slumber but into a reality entirely his own. a reality constructed from the shards of his own boundless paranoia. Phineas, the city healer, continued his nightly visits, bringing his tonic, which Kalen, with a triumphant, knowing gleam in his eyes, would always drink. He believed it was a new method of infiltration, a direct line to the hub. He would then, with manic glee, recount his journeys into the heart of the conspiracy, providing Phineas with increasingly wild and convoluted intelligence reports. Phineas, for his part, would listen patiently, his benign smile unwavering, occasionally adjusting his spectacles or offering a non-committal hum of understanding. He saw only a man succumbing to extreme sleep deprivation, his mind weaving elaborate self-serving narratives to cope with its own unraveling. He would make notes in a small leather-bound ledger, detailing Kalen's escalating hallucinations, his increasingly rapid speech, and the deepening crimson of his eyes, all signs of a mind dangerously close to collapse. The tonic, a potent sedative known for inducing vivid if nonsensical dreams in insomniacs, was, in Phineas's professional opinion, having its intended effect, slowly but surely. The end of Alchemist Kalen's relentless wakefulness arrived not with a bang, nor with a whimper, but with a peculiar, almost imperceptible fading. One Eldorian morning, as the perpetual mist hung heavy and the city began its slow waking hum, Ilara found Kalen slumped over his workbench. His head rested upon a particularly dense scroll detailing the conspiracy's impact on bovine somnolence patterns, his quill still clutched in his skeletal fingers. His eyes, though wide open, were utterly still, fixed on a single, dust-motor-filled shaft of moonlight that pierced the grime-caked window. There was no breath, no pulse, no tremor. Only the faint, almost imperceptible hum in his left ear remained, a phantom echo of a symphony only he could hear. His face, gaunt and etched with years of sleeplessness, held an expression of profound, terrifying clarity, as if, in his final moment, he had indeed seen everything. The Vigilant Circle, discovering him, did not mourn in the conventional sense. They understood. Kalen had not died. He had simply reached the ultimate unblinking state of wakefulness he had so desperately sought. They carefully moved his body, arranging it reverently on a makeshift bier of ancient tomes and alchemical apparatus. They collected his scattered parchments, particularly his final, endlessly revised copies of Awake or Be Enslaved, their pages thick with his frantic, almost illegible script. Horatio solemnly counted the remaining grains of sand he had left meticulously piled on his workbench. Master Lyra carefully transcribed the final, whispered, incoherent words Kalen had uttered in his last conscious moments. Silas sharpened a final needle to an ethereal point, its gleam reflecting the single unblinking eye of his fallen comrade, and the ticker, with an unnerving precision, placed one of his smallest, most perfectly polished pocket watches into Kalen's still hand, setting its hands to the precise moment of his cessation, as if marking the final triumphant second of his relentless vigilance. Kalen, the sleepless alchemist, was never buried in consecrated ground. His companions, respecting his peculiar legacy, wrapped him in a shroud made from discarded sleep-soaked blankets which Kalen had obsessively analyzed, and carried him under the cloak of deepest night to an unmarked, forgotten corner of the whispering marshes, where the mist perpetually hung, and the croaking of frogs sounded to them eerily like the distant hum of Kalen's imagined vibrational frequency emission chamber. They believed his vigilant spirit would continue its watch from there, observing the world's slumber from the edge of the known. And so, the legacy of Alchemist Kalen, the wakeful fool, began. His story, initially dismissed as the ramblings of a madman, slowly began to filter into the collective consciousness of Eldoria, often in the most peculiar ways. Copies of his Manifesto, Awake or Be Enslaved, though largely illegible to the common eye, circulated in clandestine circles, passed from hand to hand among those who suffered from persistent insomnia or harbored vague, inexplicable anxieties about the nature of their nightly repose. The Eldoria Grand Library, now missing several key historical texts and possessing a lingering faint scent of ozone and burnt nettles, eventually catalogued Kalen's collected works as curious dissertations on somnolence and delusion, shelved them in a locked, dusty section, and forgot about them. For centuries, Kalen's ideas lived on, inspiring both laughter and unease in odd corners of history. Traveling bards, performing in smoky taverns, would often include a farcical song about the mad alchemist of Eldoria, exaggerating his gaunt appearance and his wild accusations against pillows and the moon. Satirical playwrights would stage comedies where characters, driven to madness by wakefulness, would engage in absurd arguments with inanimate objects, a clear nod to Kalen's interrogation of bedclothes. These were met with roars of laughter, the common folk finding solace in mocking what they perceived as obvious insanity, thus reinforcing their own comfort in the natural embrace of sleep. Yet, there was always a lingering thread of unease. Whispers persisted in the shadowed alleys of Eldoria, tales of people who, after reading fragments of Kalen's Manifesto, found themselves unable to truly rest, plagued by a vague suspicion that their dreams were not their own, that the very quiet of the night was somehow too quiet. Parents would admonish restless children with the phrase, "Don't stay awake too long, or you'll end up like the mad alchemist, arguing with the moon." The phrase, intended as a humorous warning, sometimes caused a shiver of disquiet, a faint, unsettling echo of the vast, unspoken truth Kalen had so desperately tried to articulate. In later centuries, as Eldoria experienced its own industrial revolution, and the clatter of machinery replaced the gentle hum of looms, Kalen's ideas resurfaced in unexpected ways. Early factory owners, obsessed with productivity, occasionally unearthed fragments of his manifesto, not for its conspiracy theories, but for its desperate pleas for eternal wakefulness. They would experiment, often disastrously, with potent stimulants and punishing work schedules, unknowingly mimicking King Oberon's foolish decree and often resulting in a workforce that, much like Oakhaven, descended into a collective, hyper-aware exhaustion that crippled output rather than increasing it. The idea of stolen time from sleep found its way into the rhetoric of early labor movements, albeit without Kalen's elaborate conspiratorial framework, though some more radical pamphlets would occasionally quote him, out of context, creating a peculiar blend of genuine grievance and delightful lunacy. Even the burgeoning field of psychology, centuries later, would stumble upon concepts that, to a truly awake observer, might bear a curious resemblance to Kalen's ravings. Discussions of the unconscious mind, of subliminal suggestion, of the brain's filters for sensory input, and even the therapeutic use of dream analysis would inadvertently echo Kalen's darkly humorous, terrifyingly prescient theories. No academic would ever cite the Alchemist's Manifesto, awake or be enslaved, of course, but the faint, unsettling scent of his ideas permeated the very air, like the lingering aroma of burnt herbs and old cheese from a forgotten laboratory. The vigilant circle, continuing their work in the shadows, gradually dwindled, their numbers reduced by the inexorable march of time, or perhaps by the subtle, ever-present forces of the great slumber itself. Elara eventually vanished. Some say she became one with the stars she so meticulously charted. Horatio dissolved into the dust and sand he so obsessively counted. Master Lyra's voice, already a whisper, faded into the silence of forgotten languages. Silas' needles, though still impossibly sharp, eventually rusted. And the ticker? Some say he is still out there, polishing watches, perpetually marking the stolen seconds of time, a silent, unblinking sentinel. perhaps the last true inheritor of Kalen's unwavering, terrifyingly lucid conviction. And so the story of Alchemist Kalen, the wakeful fool, remains. A man who believed sleep was a government conspiracy, whose life was a testament to the profound, unsettling consequences of unwavering, sleepless conviction. His legacy is not one of scientific triumph or grand revolution, but rather a persistent, uncomfortable question, echoing through the long, quiet hours of the night. What if, just what if? The comforting darkness, the blissful oblivion, the sweet surrender of sleep is not a blessing but a carefully engineered illusion, a silent, pervasive trick played on us all, ensuring that we remain, for a third of our lives, blissfully, tragically, and utterly unaware. The answer, of course, is elusive, lost in the mists of Eldorian history, whispered on the winds that carry the faint scent of ozone and forgotten dreams, leaving only a lingering unease, and perhaps a gentle, distracting curiosity for those who find themselves, like Kalen, staring up at the ceiling, utterly, irrevocably awake.